expanding on the therapeutic benefit idea of it, and kind of what you were saying, that this is connected. This isn't just a singular ideology or a thing that we're talking about. How it is connected to the strictly web. My youngest son has autism, and I have learned through him he is a better person outside. He learns better. He can focus. He's just better outside. And I thought that was him until I realized no, it's other people with autism and other kinds of developmental disabilities. But I have a dream and a goal of converting our property into some kind of retreat and using it for therapeutic benefits. My home is just a whole different type of outside. So yeah, expanding, connecting with things you wouldn't think would be connected. Right. Yeah.
There's a pretty broad thing there. Schizophrenics, you're actually treated by sending out the arms of water. And so there's a whole big workforce there that we have to tap into.
How do you
So inexpensive.
go to the woods?
It's a big part of it, but like in the areas where they're struggling, Philadelphia, and it's really heartbreaking to see people so disconnected from themselves. I think nature would go a long ways in helping people start sorting out their lives and be able to do something. But they're not going to leave Skid Row or wherever they're at, where all the drugs are being made available to them quite easily. They're not going to just leave and go to a forest somewhere and hang out. It'd be nice to see that.
We have a naturalist, Bob Garrett, a naturalist in St. Louis, and he works with some of the high schools with taking them to some property that's closer, some land that's closer. And he said he did some tree planting with some high school students. They tried to put the trees in the plastic buckets into the ground. They didn't know. See out of it. Like he said, it was really amazing to see them understand nature. But they found they connected. Where did you take the Bell Fountain or something? Yeah. Super close to North County, St. Louis. Really interesting.
Just think of our workforce, the kids in school who are usually on the phone or TV or I don't know what they're doing. And people who have drug issues, mental health issues. I think they would love to plant things. Just having circles.
I probably spend about I think spend lots on it. A lot of the 20 must have so I do a lot of first aid, like crisis.
And it's not isolated. My youngest son is 18. He's in Jobport and towards the bottom of the state, in the Hills area. And he said every kid there has, they don't trust other people, much less other kids. And that's heartbreaking. To be that young and jaded and cynical.
It really got isolated.
Doesn't have to be that way.
I wanted to add, garlic mustard makes very festive.
That is crazy good stuff.
I don't know if there's the potential there, eventually. North St. Louis has Earth Fans Organic Farms, and it's a farm that's been going, a continuous farm for like over 100 years, and they do organic farming there, but they have applicants from the high school that can come and do an internship there, so they can apply for scholarships. So they have people, do have a lot of interest from the high school up there at the McClure, where they apply and come do an internship for organic farms and learn farming practices and different things like that, who want to be farmers. And they said that the interest and the enthusiasm of the kids. Because it's another option that they never thought of, because not everybody's gonna be able to go to college or trade school, but this is a skill that not as many people have. So I look at this and I think there's a potential for that at some point for the youth to be, you know, pulled in and at a young age to already thinking about that. So when you're talking, I think that would be cool. There's, you know, you get to the point where there's internships or scholarships available for kids to come in their high school level. They'll do that during the summer, and they offer volunteer classes or classes online and things for the kids or other people. That's something this I think would apply to.
There's a lot of internships out there. Wolfer, is it Wolfer International? That has, is a big group that has all kinds of agricultural internships all over the world. And then people like Greg Newby, they always want interns. So any of these gurus that are on videos and YouTube and things like that, they're always looking for interns. So don't be afraid to ask. You might maybe have to wait, or you might be, you never know, you might be the first in line. So.
And I wonder sometimes if they couldn't, if that's not something that could be pushed to the high schools, to kind of through the guidance counselors, because that might really appeal to some kids who might already be in an ag area, but that's you know, we have a big ag area, but we kind of don't have, you know, FFA or anything in our high school, very small. But there might be 4-H, I'm sure that something is available to them. There might be something they wouldn't even think about. And we do that this summer.
Yeah. And interns are a great way to get kids started. My daughter still has, all three of my kids still have connections to the people that they had internships with. So it's very big part of your life skills later on. So. Cool.
It'd be nice to see the prison pipeline change to the forest.
Like that, I think that we've highlighted yet another area that forest farming can contribute to that community building, the vision of mental health, connection to one another and the earth. So thank you for such a wonderful conversation. And with that, we'll start to transition back in and get ready for our talks for the day.
Coffee.
It's still done that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Oh, no.
Oh, no. You know, it takes you.
Is there anyone in this Zoom?
Yeah.
Yay.
Yeah.
Good morning, Andrew.
Hi, good morning.
Okay, we are almost ready to start with our first presentation.
Yay.
Okay, we're up and running.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And you can see the presentation all right in Zoom?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we are. No, it's on. So if you show anything,
Yes.
so try to do it here so that those online people can also see it.
Okay. Can I put this here?
Yeah, you can put it here and then. Okay, all set?
All set. Where's the clicker? Is this
Yes. Make sure,
Okay.
see if, yeah,
Yeah, that works.
okay.
All right, what's the time?
It's right about 8:50.
All right, everyone, may I please have your attention?
Okay.
Can people online hear me?
They will hear you through this.
Can you hear me online?
Oh, yeah, we hear you well.
Great. Okay. I want to invite, if anybody has a very pressing question that they want to get out of this talk that is titled Farming Herbs in the Woods, Site Selection, Bed Preparation, and Managing Soil Fertility, which were all topics that Sugata wanted me to cover. I invite you to speak that, and Derek's going to write that question on the board, and I'll figure out when in the presentation to respond to it. And if you don't ask a question up front, just write it down and I'll answer it at the end if I can. Raise your hand, I'll call on you. No particular questions. Seriously? Okay. Well, I introduced myself yesterday, another alum of the center. So why did y'all come here? I'll ask you that again in a minute. This is an outline. We're going to talk about site selection, the right herb for your site, rather than the other way around, because most of us don't own a million small farms with a bunch of different site types. Bed preparation, which I'm trying to halfway jokingly frame as wild simulated ginseng versus everything else. Managing soil fertility, testing, soil amendments, mutual relationships between all these elements. So, yeah, what questions do you have and what brought you here? I'm gonna make somebody answer before I get to the next slide. Yes.
How much maintenance do you taking care of?
If you pick the right herb for the right site, it will be fairly minimal. I can hear your talk, just hear like specifics.
Would you mind repeating the questions for the online participants? Because we can't hear the questions.
Yes. So you asked,
How much maintenance is there?
how much maintenance is there? And I said, if you pick the right herb for the right site, it's pretty minimal. And Josh, you were saying you wanted to hear the nitty gritty details of some of this stuff as best we can figure it out. From my experience. Okay. Yeah. One final one? No. Okay. Man, I can't see the title of my slide. But it basically says something about don't fight your biogeochemistry when doing site selection. So soil pH matters quite a bit. It's usually dependent upon the soil parent material or the bedrock. Okay, so 7 is neutral. Most forest soil is slightly acidic because as leaves break down, they make weak acids and leach cations out of the soil, cations like magnesium and calcium and potassium. But on dolomite, which is not that uncommon here, or on glacial till, sometimes you have like a circumneutral around 7 or even above. And so, there's certain things that have limited pH ranges. We want to talk about soil texture of the soil on your site. This is usually expressed as a ratio between sand, silt, and clay. We'll get into that. The sweet spot is some kind of loam, which is a roughly even mix of those things. Always tilted one way or the other, usually tilted one way or the other. We're going to talk about the aspect, like what side of a dissected landscape you're on. So does it point towards the sun at midday when it's hottest at 2 p.m., or does it point towards in the opposite direction? So and then we're going to talk a little bit about the soil hydrology. The keyword here is mesic, the Goldilocks zone of soil moisture. Unless you're going to wetland plant, you don't want a saturated soil, and unless you are like something that grows in a glade, right? You don't need it to be xeric and super deserty. Why isn't this working?
So do you want this banner
No,
down here?
yes, that's great.
Okay.
Just need to go to the next slide. Okay, so
It works.
yeah, that works. So just talking about soil pH, we're also going to talk about aspect on the slide. This is I pulled off of an NRCS website. It talks about the different kinds of habitat and species assemblage that you would tend to find on different parts of the landscape. So if you look at the thing that's labeled 3, the area that's labeled 3, it says under there, you might not be able to see, it says LOESS, it's loess, and that is silt that blew onto the site or rolled down from up the hill. So it's not from the bedrock on that site. So that loess could be sitting on top of dolomite, which is intrinsically alkaline because it's got it's just magnesium or calcium carbonate, some magnesium in it. But the loess on top of it could be acidic or slightly acidic, right? Because it's not from that. Yeah, so if you need something that's soil that's slightly acidic, that loess cap is going to be a great place to grow in. People talk about this for chestnuts on ridge tops and the river hills around the Missouri River, but for us forest farmers, we're talking about microsites, not sort of like regional things. So you need to learn to read the land. And then we'll come back to that slide in a minute. The soil texture triangle, that ratio of sand, silt, clay. I have to say this with caveat. A lot of forest land is in trees right now because it is clay. It is too heavy to easily do annual row crops that require plowing because it's very easy to compact clay and make it not work as a growing medium. But there's going to be little pockets throughout forests that have nicer soil to work with for forest farming. And you are really looking for those pockets. If you look at a soil map, it'll often say it's a complex between this sort of heavy clay soil and this loam of one kind or another, like a 70-20 or 80, and if you go and take soil cores throughout a forest or a field even, you'll see there's often a lot of variability. So you're not going to plant the herbs in the heavy clay necessarily, right? I mentioned the aspect, and this people think it's always like north and south. It's actually northeast and southwest is the axis that we're talking about. So on the protected aspect, this is like if you're standing on that hillside and facing down slope, you'd be facing towards the northeast-ish, you know, with like a slice of the pie in front of you. Timber tends to grow like weeds here, so do invasive species, and assuming they're not outcompeted, so do your forest herbs. There's a pretty big swath that people might call like a neutral aspect, where you get a mix of the more moisture and shade loving stuff with the more dry stuff. And then on the exposed aspects, which people would also think of like high and dry sites as exposed, you know, ridge tops, depending on the soil moisture regime. In my part of the world, foresters call those exposed parts okie dokie sites because they grow oak better. Oak is drought tolerant, and so it, even though it grows more slowly, if there's not enough moisture for sugar maples and to grow, then the oaks actually have a chance. So generally, but not always, we're going to be thinking about that protected aspect. Soil moisture. So this is just sort of summarizing what I was just talking about. You can go out and measure soil moisture, and you can kind of tell by what's happening on the ground. Okay, before we move on to bed preparation, that was a whirlwind. Let's hear some more specific questions about site selection based on just environmental factors, and we can get into some nitty-gritty maybe. Name a species that you're interested in, Josh.
I was just thinking the ramp, that's all about the very bottom, so very specific. The bedrock.
What do you think that bedrock was?
Specifically, I mean,
Not too specifically, but right. So you've got this limestone that's melting and forming nice new high cation kind of soil. And you know, some of these herbs, as we'll get into, really have specific pH ranges. So the fact that there was, and it's in a sort of a cove, right? So and what were the overstory species? I could predict, but I want you to tell me.
yeah, it was lower slope, good soil, red oak.
Yeah, so I've seen that very phenomena many times in the Ozarks, where it's like the toe slope, and it's sort of like right above the floodplain. So you've got these slow growing perennial herbs that aren't going to get washed away in a terrible flood, but you've got the most fertile soil just sort of piling up, like in the angle here, like between where my fingers are, I don't know if you can see me, where my fingers are meeting here, there's like a little bridge of where soil piles up, and that's just a great forest farming site generally. So if you have one of those on your land, you know, plant there first, fill it up with ginseng or whatever it is that your business plan that you develop suggests you might pursue. And there's some herbs that maybe don't want or don't need as much calcium, but like a lot of the frequent flyers and talks like this, like ramps and black cohosh, blue cohosh, and ginseng and golden seal. Those particular 5. Oh, that reminds me, I have handouts, right? Don't we have handouts for everyone? Okay. That would be great. Thank you, Raylan. Yeah, so
The Christmas burn is a good painting of sites, although it has a little bit of this area.
people go back and forth about using plants that are already growing on the landscape to suggest to you where you should be growing.
So I have the model. Do you want to talk about
Great.
it?
No, you just have them handed out. you're going to get 5 forest farming handouts for specific species. They're 1-pager and they have really nice illustration on the back. And I can, if anybody asks me for it, I can email it to you if you're online. These are from my employer, Rural Action, made possible through a SARE grant, and I think Philippe's wonderful illustrations. Anyway, the thing is, if you look at what's growing in the understory, unless you really have a trained eye, you may or may not be getting the full picture. Because if there's a history of grazing, and if there's a history of exploitative logging at some point in the last few hundred years, which there usually is, by the way, and there wasn't a seed, so if the understory got destroyed and there wasn't a proximal seed source for some of these things, like bloodroot, for example, it spreads by ants. Ants spread its seed. Ants do not spread seed that fast. And so if it got wiped out in one stand that it was growing in, and there's not a stand next to it that has bloodroot in it, there will not be bloodroot in that stand, but that doesn't mean you couldn't plant it there, which is why I'm trying to focus on these like biophysical kind of characteristics, because you could be the person who reintroduces that stuff. Yeah. All right, let's move on. So we're going to talk about bed preparation. And we have to say this: wild simulated ginseng is famous for, if you can hang in there and grow it to a ripe old age, and the deer don't get it and the poachers don't get it, you can make a fair amount of money for not very much work on a small bit of land. This is why it's so popular for us talking about. It's definitely the most studied herb in this habitat type. The buyers who are paying this much for it have this long cultural tradition. It involves what people in the West sometimes refer to as the doctrine of signatures, where a plant is thought to be valuable for healing a disease based on an appearance that looks like a part of the human body that it heals. Well, ginseng is supposed to be a cure-all. It's a tonic. It's supposed to be good for all of your bodily systems. And maybe there's some scientific evidence for like generalized beneficial effects. The most valuable roots, the ones that are really famous that cost thousands of dollars a piece, have bifurcated at a number of points and look like a little mannequin, like a little human being. So it looks like the whole body. As far as I know, that's the only herb that any of those market conditions apply to in the United States. I could be wrong. I'm like a white man, and there's lots of other cultures and indigenous, tribal traditions and stuff that I'm not aware of. So how do you get valuable wild simulated ginseng? Well, you kind of torture it. Not really, but you put it in a site and just let it duke it out with the site conditions. If there's a rock that it hits in the soil, it's going to bifurcate, and that's going to make it more valuable. If it's able to grow only slowly, there will be more growth rings on it, and by the pound, that will make it much more valuable. However, that means it was growing more slowly. It also means that there's more chemicals that scientists could extract from it, so it's not like they're wrong, of course. Currently, there's not a price premium on any other herbs in the same way that we might talk about growing. So this is where bed preparation comes in. We often at Rural Action, we say we're promoting wild simulated ginseng, which to the Chinese buyers is indistinguishable from, and legally speaking, to our federal government is indistinguishable from actual wild ginseng that nobody planted. It's a whole can of worms. It's very complicated. It's like a commercial species that's federally endangered. There's a lot of rules. For all the other species, they're going to want beds that you are helping delineate and improve in the same way that a biointensive farmer of vegetables, the people who pour on a bunch of compost and raise beds and make their living on like a small piece of land. That's sort of the mentality that I've seen certain forest farmers adopt when growing herbs that are not ginseng. I can give you some examples, but I dug up this interesting, you can see this chart here. It's from my undergraduate research on cornfields using like permaculture techniques and just like standard organic cornfields, and very strong linear relationship in those fields between soil organic matter and soil moisture. And so what you're doing when you're adding composted leaf mold or biochar or other things we might talk about, you are reducing the number of days these plants might be having a water deficit, like they're just like free to grow and have what they need to grow the entire season. So that's why you're trying to amend the soil, basically. I'll give you an example. I've lost track of this guy and I apologize for not giving you the reference. Maybe one of you knows who it is. I think they're in Virginia. They grow Virginia snake root. When I interviewed him, when I started my master's, he was the sole provider of Aristolochia serpentaria to American Botanicals, which is that a question? Okay. I don't see a question down there, so I'm going to keep talking. Okay. This fellow is selling Aristolochia serpentaria, beautiful native understory herb, but pretty small. It has some kind of relationship with a particular butterfly. He's selling it for $125 a pound. And I told Cal Maginel, who's sort of been a mentor for me in learning plants that aren't directly, in the commercial trade. He was like, "Why? You'd have to grow thousands of those herbs to make up a pound. Why would anybody bother and do that? Because the root is so small." But this guy was growing in raised beds, and he's just dumping finished composted leaves on there every year. And so the things are like growing like carrots, and that's why he was doing it. He could make money, and American Botanicals has gotten even cagier over time about who the heck buys these plants from them. It's illegal in the US to use it as a food additive. I imagine it's some kind of alcohol admixture or something, but maybe it's not even a domestic market, so I don't know. But I found another reference when I was on this Virginia snake root kick in preparation for this talk. They were saying that for one root, which again, these are very small roots and not subject to the whole doctrine of signatures thing. In 1998, a buyer bought one root for more than $50. I don't know who that buyer was, but again, it's sort of, John Munsell was referencing that, these markets can kind of be murky. It's hard to get, a price signal as a producer for what you should be growing and how much you should be growing, how much of it you should grow and what you should be selling it for. Here's a picture of me using a rotary plow on a BCS, which is like a little Italian walk behind tractor, to make little terraces in the woods to grow herbs on for one of my studies. My thought in doing this was, when you build a terrace like this, you create a bit of that angle, the toe slope angle where organic matter and nutrient-rich soil could be deposited. And you also make it so water could soak in. It's sort of like the whole swale thing from permaculture. I think it did pretty well. And also reducing tree root competition for moisture that first year. I didn't kill any overstory trees by doing this. I did deliberately remove mid-story shrubs. And if there was a tree in the way of the rotary plow, I cut it down so its roots wouldn't be getting into the bed. It also, this is a tough implement, and it brings a lot of rocks to the soil, up out of the soil, including, almost boulders. And if you remove those, then once again, if you're not growing ginseng, like the root growing zone, these top 6 inches where all the magic happens, it's more like more like a garden bed. How am I doing on time? Good, okay. So this is a great version of the this chart is a great version of the Gingrich stocking chart. And if you're not familiar with it, I would suggest that you get familiar with it. I have a few little tools, few little tools that help you make use of this chart. I put this up here to talk about canopy gaps. When you're talking about bed forming, if you're growing ginseng, you do not want to create a canopy gap and plant, this is my opinion, and plant the ginseng immediately in that canopy gap. However, if it is a completely closed canopy and the stocking, you know, the amount of growing space in the overstory the trees take up is full, like if we're up here next to the A line, that's too much shade even for ginseng to grow at its full potential. And you want to bring it down to 90 or 80. People have suggested it could be beneficial to bring it down even towards the 70% stocking. And so if you're going to be cutting some trees, you might put ginseng a little bit adjacent to the very small canopy gaps. And I'm talking about whole tree removal, okay? I'm not talking about not single tree selection with the other uneven age management. Group selection. I'm not talking about group selection. That's too big of a canopy gap for the shade loving herbs. There are things like black cohosh, which turn out to be completely fine growing in the full sun and flower more when they get sun. Things like false unicorn root, which basically only flower and produce seed when they get sun. They could be in a canopy gap, and then you could be growing ginseng or golden seal right past the sort of immediate edge effect in the forest next to a canopy gap. The bigger the canopy gap, the more sun it's going to create, the more edge effect it's going to create. So raise your hand if you have been to the edge of a pasture next to a woodlot, and you have walked through the briars and come out on the other side of the briars into the woods, into a more open woods. Raise your hand. Yeah, so good. You want to get in there right on the other side of where the bush honeysuckle, let's say, stops fruiting, right? Because bush honeysuckle can grow on calcareous soils, which, by the way, these calcium-loving herb species love it. So if there's Linicera mackii growing there, it's giving you an indication that there's calcium in the soil. Right past where they stop fruiting, because they don't fruit if they don't get enough sun, that might be a good place to plant your golden seal and ginseng. Okay, don't be afraid to interrupt me and ask questions, because I get on a roll, you know. Here's a pretty picture of black cohosh flowering. May or may not be producing seed, probably is producing some seed. This also is a species that loves fire. People remark at Chilton Creek Management Area, that's a TNC property in the Ozarks, it always flowers after you burn, flowers much less on years that you haven't burned the season before. It also flowers more when it gets sun, right? Because it's you have to keep the leaves and the roots going. If you get enough over your basic metabolic needs, you can think about sexual reproduction. It's really, I think, just about as simple as that. Here's another picture. We have somebody who is growing sugar maple. They're not trying to make the stand anything other than sugar maple, and they're growing a bunch of ginseng under it. You can see, though, you know, there's some like sunflex. There's dappled sunlight. Those patches of sunlight are small enough that they're going to move around, and that ginseng isn't just going to cook in the sun all day. So we're all adults here. We have to I think we should use what the NRCS and soil scientists have been using for years. The extension agents have to offer us. We take a soil probe and we take, make sure we don't get any grass or mulch or anything in our probe, and we go to a place where we think would be a good place to grow our forest farming herbs, and we got to get 8 soil samples. 6 inches deep is standard. You could go deeper. And then you can send them into some place like Logan Labs. I know Mizzou has a soil lab where you can send in soil. And the numbers here will give you a pretty good estimate. You took 8 soil cores and averaged them together. So it's not like you're just getting a total snapshot. And I put up this, you may or may not be able to see this very clearly, but here we have the soil organic matter on the site is quite high, 6.72. Organic farmers like to shoot for at least 3. So for a normal farm, this is pretty good. The calcium is up here above 4,000 pounds per acre. I think I say on some slide in here that Eric Burkhart, who's a Pennsylvania forest farmer and ginseng researcher, found that 3,000 pounds and above of calcium was good for ginseng. And you have some other things, and it's you may or may not feel like amending for ginseng, certainly, but if you're trying to grow big roots that are being sold by the pound, I've got 5 minutes, gotta wrap up. Then yeah, you might put some composted chicken manure like Revita on your site if it was low in something. Oh, that's not true. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So you can add agricultural lime. That's pretty common. Pelletized gypsum is a kind of lime that doesn't necessarily raise the soil pH, but it does add calcium. So if you're trying to keep the soil pH lightly acidic, but raise the calcium, you'd want to put that gypsum down instead of the lime. We talked about leaf compost. This is quite natural. And then we could talk a little bit about biochar. I know that there's, at least you make biochar, right? You were talking about those rings of fire. I'm sure some of you have heard of the whole terra preta phenomenon in the Amazon. It's a sort of anthropogenic, super fertile soil in a ecosystem type that doesn't retain nutrients in the soil. Like all the nutrients in an Amazon rainforest are typically thought of to be like in the living biomass. It's not like sitting available in the soil, but they make this charcoal basically and mix it with refuse they have for thousands of years, the indigenous people living there. And it makes these pockets of, rich sort of orchard soil that then they grow hundreds of different species in, and these very complex agroforestry systems that are so complex that they, make, reductionist people who are used to monocultures, they don't even recognize it as agriculture, but it is agriculture. So if you're wondering what to do with stuff that's too small to make mushroom logs out of, you might make biochar using a ring of fire or some other kind of little retort, instead of just burning it. People sometimes will pile burn brush, and it's like, well, if you try to get some pyrolysis going, and we don't have time to go into that too much, but basically heat it up and get the reaction going, but starve it of oxygen and quench it with water at the end to keep the combustion from happening, you get this lovely stuff that you can mix with the compost and eventually apply top dress on forest farming plots. I wanted to look at 2 very specific examples. Again, we've talked about ginseng ad nauseum probably. I want to avoid a mistake that some forest farmers have made in thinking that everything has the same site requirements as ginseng, because it does not. Let's go through line by line. So like ginseng starts to get photo inhibited at a certain point. I think it can take more light than people generally think, but I think it's like below 60% shade or something when they've done shade cloth trials. And stop me, the shade cloth stuff is not really my expertise, but the leaves get crinkled up and then you get any more light and they just like stop growing. And, sometimes people I've argued with Ben Knapp about this. He's a silviculturalist and works for the Center for Agroforestry. He's like, yeah, the ginseng will just go dormant. And then it'll come back after a few years when there's canopy closure. And it's like, yeah, that might be true to a certain extent. And if you're a forest farmer, what good is dormant ginseng to you anyway? False unicorn root, which I will note at the end of last year, was selling for more than ginseng. Okay. Weird, the weird elusive markets, but like Appalachian Sustainable Development's Herb Hub, you can see they've tried to make the price points more apparent by, matching big buyers with forest farmers. And last time I checked, it could have changed. False unicorn root was selling for more. It will change, but it might change back. So just to think about, I was reading false unicorn root is pretty rare in a lot of parts of its range. In Illinois, like Southeast Illinois, historically, there's been populations of it. And the botanist who is writing up a report on it, has a long form profile on the species in Southwest Illinois. They're saying, it grows in these wet meadows and it blooms there and makes seed. It seeds into the woods next to the wet meadows, moist meadows. I don't know how wet it really is, but they don't make seed once they get fully shaded. So there's some kind of sweet spot there for sexual reproduction. So that's pretty different, right, between these two high value herbs. And I've met people who think that it's impossible to grow false unicorn root because they can't get it to grow on the heavy clay in the full shade that they planted it on. The overstory of both of these species can vary more than you might think. There's commonly an association with sugar maple and leaves that rapidly decompose. And part of that is because thick oak litter prevents seeds from falling and spreading, right? But if you burned those off and planted some rootlets or planted some seed, you might have better luck. Germination requirements, ginseng needs cold stratification. So if you came to Rural Action and bought ginseng seed from us, we'd put it in the fridge for, I don't know how many number of weeks that the scientists told us to. And then we sell it to you so that you plant it in the ground that fall. And then the next spring it germinates rather than having to wait an extra year, artificially. Turns out false unicorn root, there needs to be light hitting the seed, according to the research, for it to germinate, which is sort of just a different key. Not all of these plants are the same, right? So if you want to get into one, you have to learn what it needs and wants. Both of them benefit from a lot of organic matter in the soil. I want to pay attention to there's different numbers for the soil pH requirements for ginseng in the literature. I'm using the one that's on your handout that Andrea Miller put together and Tanner Filia, which says 5.5 to 6.5. Whereas this over here, the false unicorn root, it's saying 4.5 to 6. So, we have some overlap, but in general, the sources that I can find would suggest that false unicorn root likes the soil to be more acidic. And the places that I've seen it on iNaturalist growing in the state of Ohio, for instance, tend to be in association with the same places, not the same positions on the landscape, but the same sort of areas as where there's like remnant shortleaf pine stands. And when I've gone to the points, even if I can't find the false unicorn root that somebody took a picture of, there's like mountain laurel growing, which is not that common in most of Ohio, but it's like an acid-loving species. So just like looking for some of those associations. And then the soil texture for ginseng can be varied, but of course it's going to grow faster in something that's loamier rather than heavy clay. And a lot of times, the references that I've seen talking about where you see false unicorn root growing is like a sandy loam that's high in organic matter, which kind of buffers the droughty dry, xeric quality of what would be, you know, a pretty sandy soil. Yep, here's another system we've talked about. We've got maple syrup coming off these sugar maples. These are tulip poplar, I think, but you know, you can picture a stand of golden seal underneath these, and there's no competition between the golden seal and the sugar maple. So yeah, just more about the site preferences. I always say something about reintroducing elk in Ohio as a joke to my friends back in Ohio. The favorite slideshow. But did you have any questions? I see a question.
Yeah, so on the ginseng handout you have listed mature forest canopy trees, which conspicuously omits hickories. I was wondering if there was a problem with black walnut or hickories generally.
There's no problem with juglone toxicity as far as I know. Huh? Oh, yes. They were asking, there's handouts that the one on ginseng talks about canopy trees that it grows in association with. Our friend here mentioned conspicuously absent was any hickory species. They were, I think, wondering about juglone toxicity. I believe there are people, including people that Gene Garrett is friends with, who grow ginseng under black walnut veneer plantations. That's what I've been told. I don't think there's any interference there. And I think it.
Question on ramps.
I don't think there is, but I can't say for sure. Yes.
Yeah, I've heard though that walnut trees produce a chemical, poison chemical in the ground after them.
The question was, or a comment was, I heard that black walnut produces a chemical that prevents other plants from growing. Yeah, Shabu Jose, my research advisor, did a bunch of research on that and published a bunch of work. And it's true, the roots mostly, though it sometimes, you know, comes out of the leaves, can inhibit the growth of certain species. Certain species are not particularly susceptible to that. In Kentucky, for example, a lot of the running buffalo clover, extant remnant populations are growing in association with black walnut. It's hypothesized that is because it doesn't mind the juglone, and so it has this competitive advantage when there's juglone in the soil.
I think a classic example of nightshade species.
Right. Nightshades are very susceptible to that phytotoxin from the black walnut. I'll come back to you.
Economically, in the floodplain might not be the best place to start. I'm not sure the right term, but the elevated floodplains before you get to the coastal. Are those generally growing sites for these shade levels?
Yes, I think it depends on the frequency of flooding, you know. If there's a 100-year flood scheduled to come every 3 years because of global warming or whatever you want to call the climate, urbanization, right, more runoff, you know, and then going a little higher is good, but I don't think all those flood terraces, you know, like above the floodplain. Yeah. I saw a hand over here.
Two questions. One is specific to ginseng. Does drywall, which is gypsum based, that something that can be used to amend soil? Is that generally a toxic idea?
I used to work for the EPA, and we were doing a study on how much mercury from fly ash we could put in drywall and have it not leach out, and like 30,000 homes had to be torn down because the research was incorrect and it was leaching out hurting people. So I would say, try and apply the soil amendment, because rather than the drywall. That's just me.
Okay. And then the second question is, a lot of these plants are, it's easy to ship seed, and but cold stratifying and planting seed is like one of the hardest types of seed to propagate, or in your experience.
You mean ginseng?
Well, ginseng and like from seed is more challenging than from a plant stock. So,
Don't say that across the board because it wouldn't be true.
okay. Also, as a beginner, I guess as a mature to this,
I want to say this in response to your question about like planting from seed. Is it too difficult? Is it unfeasible? I've met ramp growers who they just go out to their patch of ramps and harvest all the seed every fall. And then they'll go take a leaf blower and blow the leaves off and scatter it and put the back on the bed. And it takes, maybe 7 years from seed to see like a appreciable ramp bulb, but that's a lot cheaper if you're a business person than digging up a bulb to plant it and then you're going to dig it back up. It's like you're gonna have to find somebody to pay you more than you paid for the bulb the first time it went in the ground. So
that was to get to what plants are able to self-propagate, I guess. So if I was gonna go plant a few plants and hope that they might expand their territory.
this might be a question for our next speaker.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Badger.
Didn't even use my Biltmore sticks. Dang. Good to see you. Oh, no. Here, I'll help you. I'll get a.
Get started.
Andy, of this, I hear that you mentioned about ramps. Did he talk about anything else?
No. You talked about, he was more about site selection and things.
Great.
Okay. So we have our
I have a. Yeah, that's pretty good.
So our next presentation is by Dr. Nadia Navarrete-Tindall. And she's going to talk about native edible plants for the forest understory. So, and since we are live streaming, so please try to stay here.
Okay, I will. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I didn't participate. Let's see, I hope you can hear me well. Everybody on in Zoom, let me know if you don't hear me. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this workshop, Sugata and Railing. This is really great. I wish I would have participated in the whole workshop because it looked like a wonderful set of speakers and topics. And in the 30 minutes that I have, I'm gonna try to, I will just cover a few of the plans that we are working with here at Lincoln. And to get started, I run what we call the Specialty Crops Program, previously known as native plants program. The truth is that I mainly work with native plants. So if I tell people specialty crops, they always go back and say, no, you're native plants. And that's the truth. But because there are so many native plants that we have, right in Missouri, we have more than 2,000 species. And I think we are just touching a few of them. Commercially, here in Missouri, we have maybe 300 species or just about 300 species. And very few of them are, they are known to be edible. Most of them are. But the truth is that we keep learning. And so the specialty crops program, the main goal is to promote native plants in general. We focus on native edibles because when I first started working with native plants, I remember people asking me, so are they edible? So I thought that was a good topic to get started. And now everybody's doing it. I mean, there's so many people interested in this that I think that we have so much potential in agroforestry and in woodland plantings. We have a couple locations on campus at Lincoln. How many of you have not been at Lincoln University? Are you going to be? Or are you how many of you are from out of state? Well, welcome. For those of you who can come, that you have time to come sometime to Lincoln, please let me know. We can give you a tour of some of the really amazing demonstration areas we have. This is what we call the Native Plant Outdoor Lab. It is right in front of the cooperative extension and research offices. We have more than 100 native plants, including edibles, ornamentals, and others, from herbaceous to woody plants. This is how it looks in the summer. Some of the days, and Railing knows it, and Sugata have seen them. And you can see here, our beautiful, on the right is our beautiful, one of the beautiful persimmon trees. And I tell people, how many of you live work in an office that there are persimmons in the front, in front of your office? Why don't we make it common? When we planted, actually these persimmons were established on their own by maybe some of the creatures we have around. It might be raccoons, I think. And we ended up with, if you see, we have on the left a male and on the right a female. Many people that come to the university are not from the US. Several question, what are those fruits? They look edible, so they started eating them. I was at the beginning I was taking data. How many fruits do we have? Not anymore, because everybody's eating them. So those are the things that we at Lincoln do. So we are an extension. We're trying to promote what we have, not what we don't have. So that's one example. We have a finca. Anybody familiar with the word finca in Spanish? Some of you are. You speak Spanish?
Yes.
What is it?
It's basically like a farm.
Exactly. It's a small farm, but it's also the acronym for a project that I had back in 2014 that is called Families Integrating Nature, Conservation, and Agriculture. So as a result of that program, that project that we got funded, we have this urban farm that we call Finca Eco Farm on campus. Has more than 50 native edibles. Many of these plants, if you see, let's see, I'm not doing a good job with this, but here we have a shade garden where we have white leeks We have a golden glow, and I'm gonna talk about it, and I better get going. We have also a planting of native fruits at Busby Farm. That could be maybe we can have a field day someday, Sugata, because there's so much to share. We need time. We need to take you there. These are three-year-old trees, and they're doing really well. And I always do this. Every time I talk about native edibles, I need to remind people, if you're allergic, be aware. I'm not responsible if you don't learn your plan in advance. So be sure you know it. But I'll do my best to give some tips. So what are the importance of native edibles? I'm sure I'm teaching to the choir. I'm hoping native plants are good for everybody, not only for us, but also for pollinators, for wildlife. In the finca, for example, we have groundhogs. Many people say groundhogs, but I do want to live with them. I want to be sure to be able to produce at the same time maintain wildlife. We're just displacing them everywhere we are. So we share with wildlife. And also, but at the same time, we are also trying for these plants to provide income. There are all kinds of native plants. Today, I'm just gonna focus on some that we use for the leaves. And so we call perennial greens. And we have I actually had 3 grants from the Department of Agriculture. Sure. We have if anybody here is interested in applying for a specialty crops grants, do it, because they are being supportive. They started supporting elderberry and other fruits, and they are supporting us to do work, outreach and education work with perennial native greens.
Find information about the specialty crops grants.
It's in the Missouri Department of Agriculture website. Sure. And if you need any advice or support, letter of support, let us know, because they give grants to farmers and educators, and it's pretty open for everybody. We do have a part of this project is gonna have what we call dining wilds. We have been doing dining wilds since 2012. When we first brought Doug Tallamy. People know Doug Tallamy. If you don't, please learn about him. And we talk about it later. We serve here food prepared with at least one ingredient being native edible. So today I'm just gonna be very brief with the number of plants I'm gonna talk about. Again, it's gonna be about perennial greens and some others. And so let's get started with the first one. This is golden glow. And I have this handout, and we can pass them. These are very just photos, but it helps you to to learn about these plants. And I also brought a plant, native.
I do have a question. I planted 5% trees 13 years ago.
And may I stop you? I only have 30 minutes. So can we talk about persimmon?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but yeah, we need to stay. Let me finish here and then we'll talk about persimmon. We do have. So this is Golden Glow. This is a 2-year-old plant. And it is a shade tolerant plant. Somebody was asking, what can you grow in the forest that reseeds itself, that it regenerates itself? This is your plant. It grows across the state and across, it has a wide range of distribution. It is called Soshan by the Cherokee. I've seen in North Carolina, Soshan plantings. It was being like people forgot about it. So now they are relearning and they're working with the Arboretum in Asheville to distribute to families. So here we are just sharing what we know about this plant. It's very common here in Missouri. And it has all these common names because the place where it grows or the shape of the plant. But it's related to black-eyed Susan or Rudbeckia. Oh, it's still moving.
While we're waiting on that, can I just add, like, so cycling is really successful and like, they'll spread. And I'm wondering about competition between, like, if you plant Sochan next to some other less competitive plant.
That is this plant is very competitive, if not aggressive. But I think that makes it a good crop plant.
Just harvest, I guess.
Yeah, so you're right. It is very, let's see. This is just to show you how it looks at the early in the year. This is the spring seedlings. Thank you, Rayling, it works now. And pretty soon it's gonna be like that. It's just about the way it looks in the pot. At this point, you harvest the leaves and you can make a salad. You can eat it raw. But later on, it will become a little strong flavor, and then you can cook it. So this plant by any means is toxic, and there's so much about native plants. Usually you say toxic, poisonous, because sometimes people eat too much, and maybe they might be allergic, but it doesn't mean that it's gonna kill you. So this plant is pretty safe. It is very common. This is how it looks in June. It's almost like it starts growing pretty tall. And later in the fall is what you see. And it's why the name Golden Glow, because it grows in the shade. So again, this is a good plant that could be in woodlands that are open. I've seen it grow it along the river, the Missouri River, in bottomlands, where it's all you see, Golden Glow. But what a nice way to, Badger.
Possible to plant it like seed and have it grow that way?
You can grow it from seed. I have some, I'm showing you the seed in a minute. That was your question?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about establishing patches. Plug or seed or.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. Part of the project that we have with the MDA is to work with farmers, and we establish little patches that they don't have it in their farm yet. And we have some examples on campus, and they do spread very nicely. You can start them like that. And now Missouri Wildflowers Nursery finally started selling it. I kept telling them people are really, they want this plant, and now they finally did it. So this is this is later, maybe in May, you can harvest these leaves. At this point, they might be a little strong for some people. So I usually blanch them, and if I want to save them for later, see how the stand looks like. It might be some in the company of some grasses like wild rice, they can grow in the middle. So it doesn't have to be a pure stand. And this is how the plant can be grown or propagated by seed or by plant division. The most common way is plant division, and because it's so abundant, I don't encourage to do it from public land by any means, but if you have a stand in your own land, you can definitely divide it. We actually have one in the finca. We grow it in the kitchen greenhouse. So that's our nursery. We let the plant grow and we harvest and see how far we can go. So you can be harvesting these leaves up to 3-4 times a year. But it's better to have it in the shade. They can grow in the sun, but then it gets a little, in the shade, the flavor is much milder. And you're welcome to try the leaves of that one. That doesn't have any chemicals. We use organic fertilizers. So in that, like native, any other natives, they need to be cold stratified, the seed. And we still don't know much about the nutritional value. I mentioned the Ashland Arboretum in North Carolina. They were doing some research about it, but haven't found any results yet. So we're gonna be working with 2 researchers, one researcher on campus that is doing, he's gonna help us to find the nutritional value. This is what we do, because the harvest might be fast. So if you want to preserve some, why not gather it and blanch it and freeze it and use it in recipes. My favorite is in quiche, and we make a soup that is just really to die for. Someday we have to do, actually we are planning to do a dining well this year on campus, and it might be by the end of the year. And I hear you talking about ramps. I'm sorry I came a little late to hear what Badger was saying. And you have a nice drawing so you can see what the whole plant. And I'm just gonna show you what we have done here on campus. This was also supported, the work we did with wild leeks was supported by another MDA grant. And it was not completed, but we have some results. This is just to show you how ramps look here in Missouri. Some of you might not know it, but I'm not encouraging again to go forage it, grow it. I know that it takes up to 7 years, but there are many nurseries that are producing the ramps now. And I'm glad I didn't destroy my little plant that I brought you. This is a year, actually I have 2 plants coming here. Maybe you can see it. I just found that it's 1 year old seedling for me. So that plant is, that seed was established 18 months ago. So you can imagine what the feeling of having the little babies coming. So it's fun to grow it, but the same way as fruit trees, you have to wait years for them to produce. Why not doing that with wild leeks? If you go and see something like that, if you want to forage, please don't take the plants, maybe the leaves. The leaves are, and also be sure that you know that you can do it wherever you are. Last year, I saw somebody selling plants that were foraged at the farmer's market, but many people complain because we understand that if you start doing that in a place like that, you're gonna destroy the populations. And that is what happens in places like North Carolina. So it's, I went to a place where nothing, it was protected. It was public, but protected in an area that wasn't. You could tell the difference. And even the people that were harvesting or foraging, the leeks, they were so sloppy, they even left some of the plants, just like, it's easy, it's cheap, I don't pay, leave them behind. So I just hoping that here in Missouri we don't do the same. So if you find somebody foraging in the market, please check where the source is. If it's private land, I mean, they can thin it and they can sell some. And this is just to show you all the little phases of wild leeks. This is how they look about at the beginning of March. And I have them growing in my yard. So what you see here is a little, it's a pin oak acorn. So they're very little. And you see the plant that you are looking at the path. This is later, March, April, they are looking like that. And it's when I go and harvest some of the leaves, never the bulbs. And this is a plant that is ephemeral, like many woodland species. They just, they stay green for a few months, but then later they disappear. But different than other woodland species, they bloom later in the summer. So while the leaves are getting senescing or getting wilted, and I just want you to see there are some other species that grow here, celandine poppies here. This is wild lettuce. So naturally they grow in woodland areas, and also you can find it growing with spiderwort, another edible. And later in May, this is your inflorescence. It looks like garlic, it's what I call escape. And then it produces beautiful flower. In our yard, and also at Lincoln, we have the seed is very, we have a lot of seed producing because we have the pollinators. And I hope you can see with this little video I have here, our sweat bee. I hope you can see it. There it is. So, sorry?
How tall is this thing?
It's like this tall. So this is, and you can grow it in your yard. I'll show you some pictures some of those pictures are taken in our yard. The fruit form when it's still green. And then this is how the seed looks like. And the seed is very, very special. It's an allium species related to any onion, but it's the only one that has the completely round black seed. And it's so beautiful that I'm waiting for somebody that is an artist that makes some earrings that look like that. I will buy them and I will promote them for you. I might have one lead. So if you know of someone, so this is how they look. And this is in our backyard in Colombia. So you can do it. I mean, I'm talking to grow these plants in small locations. Could be an urban farm or in your own yard. How to propagate it? Or how to propagate ramps from seed. This again was done in the fall. This is Jerome, our former student. And probably some of the plants that you see, that this was planted in November, 2021, and then this year we are seeing like the plants that you see in the pot. And they require warm, cold, warm periods. So that's why you need the 18 months. However, you can use a growth chamber. We have never done it. I never got to it. We did try once and it didn't work. They like to be natural, but it would be worth trying to increase germination. Here are our little ones early in the spring. And this is in the woods. This was actually in a place I found in Colombia. So they look pretty similar. And by division, if you buy them or have your own, but you can just divide them very easy. They are they're individual plants in the crown. This is one example when we transplanting to a woodland. And this is what it can be done in any wooded area. This was a prairie forest conservation area. It's about 40 miles west from Colombia. This was in 2020. And this is 2022. All the plants produce seed. And you can imagine, this is a conservation area. The seed was just, all the seed was fall. Lots of pollinators. And this is just an example how we grow them in raised beds at Lincoln. This was probably, 3 growing seasons. We did buy the plants already growing, the bulbs from a producer. And this is what we do with them. And just as an example, this little, in North Carolina, we went to a farmer's market and they were selling those little containers they call it ramp salt. It was $5. I bought it because as a souvenir, it was just exciting to see that. So, but I can imagine people here in Missouri can do something like that. There's so much, we have support from like someone like Eleazar Gonzalez on campus. He's an agribusiness guy. I wish he would, he could work with one of the farmers in creating. I'm so sorry.
I just wanted to add, in Missouri, if you sell it at farmer's market, you don't have to charge taxes. You're tax exempt if it's plant-based in the Missouri farmer's market.
Oh, that's good to know. Did everybody hear Beverly know in this the group in Zoom that she was mentioning that here in Missouri there is no need to pay taxes in farmers market.
No sales tax charged.
Yeah, so that would help farmers to market these products. And this is just to protect. I want to emphasize that to protect population, we need to just harvest the leaves. And it's what I do at the end of the season, because it's so short again, I dry them. I freeze them because it's hard to do everything at once. So I freeze them and then dry them. So that's a way to preserve the bounty. The other plants that I wanna mention is nettles, native nettles. How many of you have eaten singing nettles? What do you think about singing nettles? Good, I usually make tea with it. Tea? And what do you do with nettles?
I agree with you. Tea is better, especially since you can sweeten it. Yeah, not my favorite.
I have samples here. If somebody hasn't seen them, I'm sure that you have. And beware, don't touch them. Singing nettle. That's Yes,
Yeah.
best. So that's what I wanna ask. What else you do with these products like that?
I follow Nettles for Textiles. And you literally making fabrics.
Yeah, and especially wood metal. And we have two species that are most known here in Missouri. Wood metal is considered to be native to Missouri. Stinging nettle is not considered native, but it's grown all over the world. And it's so nutritious that why not? And it's already there. So to control your population, eat them. So for me, these three are probably the most, or 3 or 4, are some plants that could be grown in woodlands and make money. If you find someone helping you with marketing, make value-added products. I mean, I had those that pesto made with a mix of white leeks, golden glow, and nettles, hearty and tasty. And you don't need to add the garlic because you already have your rams or white leeks leaves. Sure.
I put that nettle, stinging nettle in soup. It is such a distinct flavor. It feels really.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Josh. Yes, I remember you. Josh just was mentioning that nettles can be used to prepare soups. And I had some, just the nettles. It feels so, I mean, if you like meat, I can guarantee you that you can put them together to something with meat because it's very flavorful. And at the same time, and the color is very kind of like spring in summer. But what else do you do with nettles? Like, or what else you add?
I make a lot of tea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the most common way to use nettles here. And I know but I don't work with these plants as medicinals, but I have a friend whose daughter was having problems with, yes. It was she made a tea with nettles and duck, which is not a non-native species, but she was having problems and then she got better. She was pregnant. So, but please don't quote me on that. I need to bring you my friend. So this is wood nettle, just to give you show you a close up of the leaves. They are round compared to wood nettle. They are, and the leaves are alternate. This is wood nettles, naturally growing with white leeks. And here is stinging nettle, very distinctive. You can see that they are growing in my yard. And unfortunately, my husband didn't know that we were growing them. And the first thing ran into them. But he knows now where they are. So, am I running out of time?
Yeah, we have a break scheduled here, so
I'll just finish with this and I'll be done. Again, I didn't want to bring you too many plants today, just some very good ideas, I hope. And then you can see this poster with all the plants that you can try. And we also can show you on campus what we have. So this is how the nettles are looking right now. You can see we just harvest them from the finca about 3 days ago. And I will leave you with Bethany, which is another potential. And I have it here under herbs. It is a minty plant. It tastes like oregano, but it's also adapted to shade. So you can be creative and we can help you with other ideas. So I'm gonna finish with that. And thank you for your for being here. And if you have any questions.
And I know we are limited on time, so if any of you have any questions, if you direct it to us, like the emails you have, Raylene or me or anybody, and we can put you in touch with Nadia and go from there. You had any comment?
I'm just curious, the minerals, so they're sort of like bioaccumulators, right? That's what gives them their mineral rich, nutritious. So when I'm harvesting like along creeks in town, I sometimes am wondering or concerned about what else the metals might be accumulating.
I said I don't harvest next to trees in town. I do grow them at home.
Yeah.
And we have them on campus. You hear me talking, and this came from the finca. And you're right. I wouldn't harvest. I mean, it would have to be sure also with golden glow, even that is so common. But I wouldn't harvest along the creeks because we don't know what is in them.
Do you know, is there anywhere that you can send the material to get tested for that kind of thing?
That could be something that I get out to my list of things to do. Yeah, because I don't.
Chang-ho can run everything.
And I'll be happy to provide examples, maybe somebody would like to. What's the plant in the blue container? Is that myogender? It's violets.
Right.
Another one of these days. And this little thing here, spice bush. And you see it blooming right now. And I'm gonna leave because passing these are five bush berries. They're very, it's trying, if you are, I mean, adventurous, it's one. It's a very, they're big burst of flavor. And we use them in jams and other things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Go an hour for the cover penny. No, I'm just gonna.
So you need to.
Then. Yeah, I forgot that.
I think it was like ages.
Where does that have to go?
Hmm?
Do I have to put it anywhere? Where did that?
Oh. It's like, I'll switch again, just to clean it up. I like.
I don't know why this microphone keeps on turning off. Oh, it's already low battery. Oh, that's.
I probably can talk loud enough for them without it. I don't know if your people,
Yeah,
they'll hear it on, is this a speaker too? Or speaker? And I'll just kind of speak up.
okay. Can I have you all back? Thank you. So I hope you are liking our presentations, giving you a background on how to get started. One of the big components about getting started with the forest farming is preparing your site. And some of the tools that we have used in our research plots are timber stand improvement and prescribed burn. Are you going to cover anything about prescribed burn?
Yeah.
Okay. So so we have our next presenter. He is a consultant forester and a longtime friend, office mate, and a lot of things. So he is Carter Kinkead, and he will talk about timber stand improvement and prescribed burn to establish forest farming. Okay.
All right, thank you, Sugata. Yeah, like Sugata says, we go way back, and that's helpful to me being here, especially because you might tell from my presentation and speaking with some of you guys so far. I come from a little bit more of a traditional forestry background, traditional silviculture. I do have a fire ecology background as well, which a lot of foresters don't consider traditional, but in this context, it's very applicable. Just a side note, I am a consulting forester, but I work in the timber industry as well. I buy walnut commercially, so I know a lot about black walnut, except what medicinal herbs it's compatible with. I can tell you exactly what it costs, how it's growing, why it's there, not so much what to farm underneath. But I can manipulate them so that the canopy is favorable to forest farming conditions. And I'm learning a ton from you guys. I want to say this has been really helpful because this information is so overlapping and synergistic, and I've learned a lot. So I hope you guys can learn a little bit here about thinning and burning, and we can try to put a forest farming context on it.
Admittingly, most of the thinning and burning I've done is in more of a cost share perspective to get landowners he calls them, not to say cost share, flat rate money from the NRCS, Equip and Farm Bill. So that's sort of how I got to this. But you'll see, I think a lot of it is applicable. Let's see, is there any other, some of the data I'll actually be using some old stuff from Joint Fire Science Project. I published on it in my master's degree and so forth. And a lot of it's actually focused on woodland management. We've said the word woodland a little bit here, but we also are calling this a forest farming workshop. And we've also mentioned savannas, glades, other ecosystems. And so we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more, because without a forest farming context, these thinning and burning practices are really targeting restoration and management of a community, specifically in this context, oak and mixed oak pine woodlands. Also, just a side note, I want to say my favorite food in the entire world is a pawpaw, and that's a huge reason why I'm here. Okay. Oh, no internet? That might not work. I kind of like the zero internet idea. Just hey, okay. So, as I mentioned, thinning and burning to me from a forestry context are really silvicultural tools we're using to restore and manage ecosystems. Predominantly, most of us are in oak ecosystems. I'm going to emphasize that because, especially as we talk about successional trends, future forests. One thing that we may not have emphasized enough to my liking here is that forests are not stagnant. They are so dynamic, changing in their natural mortality. And you may have a perfect oak canopy for your forest farm now, and in 10 years, your ash are dead, and there's blight, and there's, your canopy can change. They're very dynamic. And so I want us to think about this forest farming more as like a ongoing process. You can't always have the same medicinal herbs year after year, even if you've cultivated an amazing, plot and seed bed, because your canopy will change. And so I think we need to really focus on how it will change, why it will change, and the interventions we have available to kind of stop that. So specifically when we apply these things, I'm thinking of composition and structure. And that sort of expands out into affecting your physical and chemical processes and your physicochemical environment as a whole. And all that hopefully impacts your function in a good way. And so one thing Janine said yesterday, Josh said it, we've heard it multiple times here, is that probably the most important thing, especially with thinning and burning, but forest farming as a whole, is know your site. Pick the right site, observe your site, understand the processes you're seeing, the dynamics that are happening without intervention. A lot of people want me to come in and thin and burn, and I can identify the stage of succession really quickly, and the composition takes me a few minutes. But I don't necessarily know, if I haven't been there in the dormancy and the growing season and the following growing season, exactly what's happening over time there. Josh has a lot of similar experiences on consulting environments, and it's tough to walk in. You can tell people where you're at. And a lot of the things that are going on are ubiquitous across at least the Midwest, but every site is different, and drivers are different from site to site, even within a natural community, one hill slope. And I think Badger emphasized this before, but on the same hill, we may have open savanna on the top of the ridge, especially in an exposed or southwest facing slope. And we may have forests down at the bottom on the toe or foot slope, like we said. And those are different environments. They're meant to be different environments. Again, a lot of people want me to thin and burn so that there's a even 60% canopy closure across that. And that's just not how I think forest farming should work. I'll often refuse those kind of interventions. So again, just to emphasize, site selection is very important. Watching and observing what's going on before you do these things is important, because you can do these things and you can't put trees back. I think we all know that. So yeah, the other thing about watching is you can't miss the legacy effects of the land use change if you're watching. You obviously will see impacts of logging, grazing, whatever you got, some combination of this undoubtedly, no matter where you are. Forest fire suppression is huge. Almost all our forests are fire suppressed, second growth. Some people say degraded. I don't know if that's a popular term here, but and then also, as I kind of described on the same hill, we have a continuum of what we're calling natural communities, intact communities. And when properly managed and cared for, these are distinct communities that function differently and hypothetically are ideal for different forest farming practices. And there's this general trend without intervention, without thinning or fire or disturbance, that it's going to mesify. Badger also mentioned xeric versus music sites. More shade, the more trees grow in absence of disturbance, the more shade we're putting, the less light available, the less growing space, maybe potentially less nutrients and water, depending on your hydrology and soils. Forests function in a different level, and without intervention, at least, especially here in Missouri and the Midwest, we really need some intervention to prevent this. Doesn't mean that woodlands becoming forests is bad. Maybe they should have been forests if they're in one of those hill slope positions, but in a big way, we've lost a lot of woodlands in the Midwest because of fire suppression. All right, so I'm going to read you some definitions of woodlands, and again, this is how I got into thinning and burning and doing some of this management. I want you guys to think critically through a forest farming context here when you read these. Does this sound like a forest farming environment to you? Because when woodland management differs from forest management, we really focus on the understory component, the herbaceous layer, what kind of, herbaceous layer we're growing. Is it diverse? Is it forbs or gramoids or legumes or undesirable invasives? So this one is from some local guys. It says 30 to 100% canopy closure, sparse understory, dense ground floor, rich in forbs, grasses, sedges. This one's 5 meter tall trees with crowns usually touching, 20 to 60% canopy cover, dominated forbs, gramoid shrubs. NRCS says ecologically true open woodlands are a type of community having 30 to 80% canopy cover, poorly developed understory, again with the forbs, grasses, sedges, and 50 to 100% ground cover. So the thresholds are a little bit, subjective a little bit. But generally, when we're managing for a woodland, we're also managing for the understory, and that's the difference in traditional forest management. We're looking, if our concern with the understory is, are there going to be oaks to replace the overwood? I mean, we really just pretty much, I don't know, Josh, maybe you disagree. A lot of traditional forestry focuses purely on oak regeneration. And I think we're missing a lot there. I don't have to tell a forest farming crowd that, but there's a lot of untapped information there. Again, back to the woodlands. These are open communities. Because they have that open character, they have species that are adapted to open environments, prairie species, and then have forest species. And so it's a transition zone. They're usually very diverse. And then you get species that, of course, need both. I studied in the Missouri Ozarks. There's tons and tons of endemics. We've all probably know something about how diverse the Ozarks can be, and woodlands are especially diverse in that context. So I made a list of questions here, kind of like right off the cuff, what comes to my head if someone says, hey, thin and burn, I want to start a forest farm. This is how the conversation in my mind kind of starts. What's already present? So I did some thinning and burning on some research plots here, at Busby, we did yesterday, and we just talked about persimmon. And there was persimmon trees. And persimmons can grow densely, and they make a lot of poles close together. Terrible optimal spacing for forestry and woodland management. They were in amongst the cedars. It was really unideal, but I had persimmons. I wasn't going to just cut all the persimmons just to meet my canopy requirement. So that one example just here within the last few weeks where what you have is very important. Don't just cut it to make a structural. Think about, are you going to harvest persimmons? Do you want persimmons in there? So what you have is critical. What percent of the trees are cull or undesirable growing stock is UGS. A big part of thinning is just taking out things that we deem undesirable, which can also be somewhat ecologically subjective based on your opinions on black locusts or, there's a lot of controversial species, but there is a level in TSI of cleaning. I should also back up here and say I'm generalizing thinning here. There is all types of thinning. There's commercial, there is thinning from below, there is heavy forest thinning, there is woodland thinning, there is one entry, try to get everything. There is ideas where you come back every few years. Thinning can look a lot of ways, and I think that's kind of, go ahead, Badger.
So next, we're gonna touch on forestry mulchers.
Yeah. In fact, that's a great time to bring it up because I probably won't review a lot of the equipment, but I have very adequate experience and information about a lot of that stuff. In fact, at Busby, I had that talk with Raylan in the consulting process. Do we want to bring a machine in and make it, mulch some of because we had a lot of debris from thinning, which is another topic we need to address. And so, yeah, I think ultimately there's a lot of trade-offs with the forestry mulcher. You have to have a machine on almost every inch of your ground. So soil compaction, whatever machinery comes with a lot of trade-offs. You have to have access. You generally erode a path and erosion. I mean, for as fast as work as it can make of some of your slash in a thinned plot, you may fight Lespedeza and invasives that came in on that trail for a long time. Also, I've seen mulching where it works really great if you've already got understory plantings. Mostly I've done tree plantings, but could work in a forest farming environment. It works good if you've already, and then you can mulch around the one thing you're growing. But in terms of just going in and doing it and then trying to establish forest farming, it's tough. I mean, you got to rake and replace, and it creates a lot of more aesthetic, but a lot of shredded debris as opposed to individual stems. And then back to the types of thinning. Some contracts I go in and I put in a lot of effort. I would do second and third cuts on the trees I was cutting down, generally small, undesirable growing stock, so that everything's below head high, so that you feel like you're in a woodland. You can see across it. It gives you that aesthetic effect. Also, there's all kinds of thermal regulation and processes that happen when you don't have ladder fuels really, really high. But to get a cost share approved, the only thing you have to do is cut the tree down. Sometimes treat it with an herbicide, a stump sprout, a Tordon, something to prevent the sprouting. But you can just thin a forest, or you can thin a forest and break down the debris and treat the stumps and stay involved. And so thinning can be a one-day exercise you do, and it can be a long-term process. I'm encouraging forest farmers see it as a long-term process. Even if you got to pay somebody like me to come 3 times as opposed to 1, subtle removals are going to be a little bit more favorable, I think, in this environment. Just a show of hands here, has anyone done TSI? What about prescribed fire? Okay, so minority, but we have some experience. Okay, moving on. What stage of stand development are we at? Successional trajectory. What is the future? And really, that's a better way of saying the next question. What does your future look like when you look at 1 decade, 4 decades, 100-year century, whatever? Without intervention, where are you tracking toward? What's going to happen, and how do you intend to change that? And a big part of that is going to obviously be not only the composition of your overstory species and canopy, but the structure. We talked earlier, Janine, I think, brought up pest species, wildlife species are obviously, I've had my avocado seeds all dug up by squirrels, and just weird things happen. And there's a lot of predation and a lot of herbivory, and meristems taste good to them apparently and are nutritious. So it's hard to watch that, but to know is very important. And a lot of times a consulting forester like me might know what to expect as opposed to a landowner. But it's good that you got to have this conversation. Don't just plant a bunch of stuff where you thin and expect they're gonna live for sure. Nobody's gonna visit them. That's not how forests work. Again, we talked about the legacy of historical land use. And then eventually, well, before you really go, you'll want to know, do you want the deer and turkey in there? Do you want squirrels? Are they a part of your plan, or are you looking at a forest farm that functions less as a wildlife habitat and more as an agricultural operation? And so there's a lot of, I know you guys probably are more informed in that, but it's again part of the conversation that I'm going to have with the landowner before I thin and burn. So, which components must stay or go, and will maintenance costs exceed initial investment? These are pretty obvious considerations, but I want us to keep those in mind as we go forward, because there are real issues that I face every day as a consultant. Okay, so just a few more considerations before I get to some of the numbers and data. Again, Badger mentioned aspect. This can't be understated. I've never seen a north and a south facing aspect function or look the same, almost regardless of if I thinned them to the exact basal area and the exact composition. The spacing doesn't work the same. The trees aren't formed the same. And the composition just wants to be different. And so paying attention to that, how fire behaves, it's always easier to burn hotter and more complete on a south slope. It's drier, it's easier. North slopes are hard. They're hard. And they shouldn't always be burned because they make a better forest in a lot of ways. So knowing where you're at on the slope is critical before you go to setting it on fire. This is kind of more of a question, but traditionally I would say that if we're going to do thinning and burning, which is common, we thin first so that the fires begin to consume the debris. The debris are a major issue for almost all of us. It impacts accessibility, not only the aesthetic, but it's just hard to maneuver in a place with tons of slash. I know, Josh, we've done some really big contracts, and even though we're really proud, we look back and people can't go through them, and I think that I've angered people with some of my best work, and I think that's just part of it. You got to know what slash looks like, what to expect if you're wanting a thinning and your canopy needs it. Yeah, so that's a kind of a soft pitch of a question that I want, it may be such that in forest farming, we actually benefit from a couple burns. And then if you have a really good forester like Josh or I, you could do some subtle canopy removals, maybe even get them to directionally fell a tree. I think that's that's my last point there. Directional felling that's not how we thin forest. You can never, it's not expected. It's not typical. You can't, good foresters could do it, but in a forest farming environment, it may be more necessary and take a little bit longer, and could even cost more depending if I like you. So last slide of considerations here. Fires, just like thinning, can be done so many ways. You can just put a slow backing fire with huge residual time and complete consumption, and almost, it'll be slow. Or you can rip a head fire through really quick and huge flame lengths and huge intensities, maybe less consumption sometimes, depending on. But knowing your fire weather forecast and how to interpret that, or sourcing an expert that can read fuels and wind and relative humidity, fuel moistures, and vent rate, lift. There's a lot of factors going into prescribed burn. I know a lot of us have done a little leaf burning or people get confident without knowing how this scales up. And I've seen terrible, terrible fires. So get with an expert. There's enough of them around. Definitely consult with someone, or just make sure that you have water mobile on site, bare soil exposed around the entire unit, and your fuel type, and you burn in the right time, generally more than 30% relative humidity. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention there is I haven't ever done this in forestry other than maybe in my mom's ridge top around her daffodils, but there is ways that we can change the way we do prescribed burn to exclude it from forest farm beds or forest farm plots. And I'd be interested to get some feedback from you guys about that. We want to make sure we're still giving the soil chemistry the same treatment, but there's going to be stem damage if you're burning and you have leaf litter under your ramps or your anything. And I think we're going to need creative ways to get around that. Because we usually in the woodland context burn in the spring. That's more practical or more common, I should say. There's trade-offs with what species you're trying to recruit. You want grasses, more forbs. So you need to know what season your forest farm needs fire or can tolerate fire. Here's some pictures. They're from the Ozarks. I should have brought pictures of Raylan sites at Busby, but this just sort of depicts the treatment. Again, I just want you to notice where I thin, it's not pretty. It's not really meant to be pretty. It's meant to open canopy. And so there's a lot of debris, and that can be shocking to some people. And then of course, where you thin and then you burn, you have fuel loads up to 300% higher. And that's can be untenable depending on your equipment and your know-how and your knowledge and expertise. So understand that fuel fire dynamic if you're going to thin and burn. It's very important. Okay, so just to review here before I show you some numbers, we're talking about burning, thinning, a combination. They can be done a lot of different ways. I'm going to generalize here. And we're targeting changes in structure and composition. We're going to observe changes in growth, and then overall, we're going to want to know, did we change the function and how? Okay, so diameter distributions is a very standard forestry, visual. We often place our stands on this and then show them over time. I'm not going to show it to you over time. There's a couple important things here. With no intervention, there's a lot of little diameter stems. If you walk into the woods, there's always a lot of regenerating stems, almost everywhere, almost always. In woodland management, we want to reduce that. We want to free that up for, like I said, a rich herbaceous layer. And you can see burning does that. We killed a lot of 1 to 3 inch stems with the fire. This stuff again was in the Ozarks. I worked with Mizzou, Forest Service, and MDC, and the Tree Ring Lab, and lots of partners on some of this. And then where we mechanically thinned, we could get even more of those small diameter stems removed, which becomes important. If you were going to hypothetically do woodland management over time, this was what I was saying before, that you still have to think about maintaining your forest through generations. So if you stay like this forever, you stop recruiting into the larger size classes. So eventually in forestry, we think about a bubble like this, allowing it to grow and recruiting it into larger size classes. And you can do that with like a fire-free interval of 10 plus years, and then start to burn again and kill small diameter stems for the next 25 or whatever. But it's easy, and I've seen this a lot, where you get into a burn cycle. Now you know what you're doing. You can burn comfortably annually, and people do in good oak woodlands, and it looks awesome. And you could grow amazing medicinal herbs, I have no doubt. But they have no future forests coming on. And a lot of our red oak present in today's forest is at its lifespan naturally and is dying. And unless you recruit more oaks or something under that, your future is bleak. You're going to be looking at more of a silvopasture, open sort of forest farm environment.
Could you ask really
Sure.
quickly, so the sweet spot then to maintain that more open woodland or maybe savanna, that side of the spectrum, you're saying like a 10-year burn cycle?
There's a huge caveat here with site productivity. And reality is you got to know your site productivity. And again, back to the aspect in the same hill. At the toe slope, it might be like 2 years without fire and you have saplings growing 5 feet and you've recruited. You're good. On the south slope, if you burn for a while, it may take long. And now sometimes that's flipped because of light. So resource availability and the various resource interactions between water, growing space, soil nutrition, and again, all these have an interaction effect with aspect. Site productivity as a whole is very important to these processes. They make caveats for every single point I'll make, can be different on a different site. So yeah, I'll try to kind of make that point in the end. But yeah, that is a great point. I'll show you some tree growth data to show you how productivity changes in how we gotta understand that. And again, back to the observe your forest, are things coming on faster than you can keep up with them, or are you is it sort of the same year after year in your growing sites? You'll know a lot about your soil productivity then. Okay, so as this just sort of recaps what I showed you there. Burning can reduce those small diameter stems, so can thinning mechanically. And really back to the resource availability, one thing I measured in these woodlands is sort of the canopy openness, or photosynthetically active radiation. People measure PAR sometimes. You can take a densiometer in the woods and do it mechanically. You can get a fisheye lens and put it into software, but knowing how much light's actually hitting that ground level is very important. And I highly recommend this as a pretty low bar. You can go out in your woods and see how much light you're getting. And then that can tell you a lot about, do you need canopy intervention? Do you need thinning and burning? Yep. And there's convex or concave, and there's trade-offs there. I don't know them all, but you could look them up and to see which suits your forest farm best. So, and to be expected here, we can mechanically open the canopy with thinning, and that has an advantage, which means we're not only doing it to the structure we want. Thinning allows us to be species selective, whereas fire is selective, but it may not be selecting for the species you want for your forest farm. It hits them all sort of equally and affects them inequally. But thinning, we can decide yes or no on each individual stem, so our species composition can be more accurate. Same with structure. But as we'll see, there's a big risk. The more you open up the canopy, the bigger burden of occupying that growing space you'll have. Be honest, I just plucked a couple. I have hundreds of these photos, and I plucked the ones that were most aesthetically different, or visually different. I know this is a plot that I thinned and burned, and I know this is a control plot. So this is unmanaged, and you can see there's still light hitting the understory in the control plot, and that's John, sorry.
You can also go online and just get percentages, their diagrams, and you can do ocular.
Okay, great.
So like grids, more grids in there, like 80%, less is more stack versus this.
Right. Yeah. So pictures have an advantage there with software, and ocular estimates can be done without the densiometer, which I think is affordable, but you still have to go back and put it in a computer. Badger?
I wanted to mention that it's talking about mushroom logs and hauling out mushroom logs, potentially an opportunity here to reduce the fuel load for dry fire at the end if you're hauling out the biggest stuff for growing mushrooms, or that's piling stuff up as you did that, you're done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's music to my ears, because for the better part of 15 years, I've left the slash and burned it to the best of my ability, but there's been very little utilization. So it's we hope forest farming can figure out a use for this. All right, back just quickly to the canopy openness. This is Blizzard et al. Elizabeth Blizzard worked on some of the same plot data I had. And I just want to show you some quick trends here. This is 2 burns, and we had a subtle over time. The canopy was subtly becoming open well after the burns were done. And I think it started to function as a woodland on these sites. Here we mechanically, these are thin and thin burn, mechanically removed it, huge light increase. But that camera that I was using was 1 meter high, and the sprouts eventually get over that. And then you're not letting light to the understory. So again, with the caveats, this is when we really got to know, how long do I have? How productive is my site before the sprouts take over? We didn't mention, or I guess I did mention a little bit about herbicide and stump sprout prevention. Tordon is a comical pathway, comical treatments that we do to stumps to prevent sprouts. It's hard to apply on a landscape scale. Yeah. You can ask Josh about that, because I hate talking about Tordon and stump sprouting. So, all right. as Badger promised you, I was going to have a Ginyard stocking diagram. So here it is. And thanks, Badger, for kind of talking about A level, B level, C level. Essentially, you can look at this. We call this in forestry understocked, fully or overstocked. And then we call that B level, and that's pretty target for woodland management. Really, it's hypothetically where the fewest number of trees optimize it, or taking all of the growing space or optimizing all of the available growing space. But in reality, trees don't grow optimal row spacing. So we target this stocking percentage. We generally get gaps that allow that rich understory and potentially forest farming species. Here's how it looks with some actual data on it. Of course, it gets real ugly, but that's part of it. Even, like I said, unmanaged forests move. They're fully stocked generally, but they'll swim. And that top axis is the average diameter. So it's complex. I won't try to interpret all of it. Essentially, you have a density measure down here, basal area here, and average diameter on the top. So this is showing we're decreasing our density, but we're actually increasing our average diameter. Our overall stocking is really in this B line with just a couple burns. Now, we can mechanically get there quick, the way below B line, but man, the response is fast. You got this many steps per acre, and it starts getting way high when the sprouts come. So as a theme of this, I think you can tell, beware of the sprouts. Mortality, we talked about this. Trees are dying right now in all the woods everywhere. Naturally, you're going to have it. Don't hinge a ton of your canopy success on just a few trees. You want to in woodland management, and that's why I left the persimmon and a few things, because you never know. We're going to have things that I left intentionally and wanted to see in 10 years that won't be there next year in some of my thin plots. So just know, again, maybe review your silvics, know which species are going to be harder, and I'll talk about fire tolerances. But know how to make a resilient woodland if you're going to do thinning and burning. Know what the composition and structure is. There's some good research on resilient woodland communities and climate change out there. And then where you add this fuel and slash from the thinning, mortality is way higher if you burn, because the fire is going to be way hotter, especially that first few times. Here's what that looks like by treatment, just to sort of visualize it. Burning causes mortality, but not as much as where you thin and burn. And then down to species, which maybe I'll just go to this slide, because we actually have some species. Again, I had some pine. We did where we thinned and burned had a lot of mortality, but not so much where we just burned. Red oaks, which is black oak, scarlet oak. There's a lot of types of red oaks. They're more susceptible than white oaks. Their lifespan's less, and that's why I said a lot of the second growth oak dominated forests we have in the Midwest today are losing a drastic part of their canopy, a significant component with the red oaks. So they're more fire vulnerable, and they're really at the end of their lifespan. So we generally, in these practices, try to favor white oak. You can see it has really pretty good success against these treatments. And then the non-oak species and others, red maple, we talked yesterday about some red maple. It's a pretty common species to cut down in TSI. We generally don't try to favor maples. They're prolific reproducers, and they're not oaks. So in woodland management, we don't, and I know that's a great answer for you, but so that's how that goes. They're not fire tolerant. They won't last well in a fire. And generally when we're thinning, we target them. Okay, now over to some of the tree growth stuff. I did some tree ring work on some of this research. As you might expect, there's a huge bump when you open the canopy and make light available. So any sort of TSI or thinning is going to increase your light, increase your available resources, and increase your growth in the residual trees. Fire diminishes that added productivity just a tad in certain environments, at least temporarily. And that's about as detailed as I can get on that. I didn't bring any cool pictures of scarred trees, but if you want to see some really cool fire scars on live trees, I have them. And I measured some of those to see, are we damaging the residual timber? And if we damage it, are we, am I ruining it? Because I left a lot of these trees on purpose, and then to scar them and make them hollow, I'm basically making mushroom logs and not meeting my canopy requirements. So, but fortunately, it's pretty insignificant. You can really damage the butt log of a tree and it's still pretty sound. And there's a big misconception. Like I said, my other hat, a lot of guys we talked about, I buy walnut commercially. There's a big misconception in my industry there that fire just ruins timber. And it's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. It can really jeopardize young trees, and there are absolutely places you should never burn because the stave logs and the veneer walnut are commodities and should be. But that being said, they're way more resilient than people that like me buy logs and spend money in the timber industry would admit. You can really clean up a burnt log, and to a buyer like me, I'm not spending less on it if the wood quality is good. Just cut above where it rotted, to be honest. You can't even tell. Don't tell anyone in the timber industry I said that. All right, ground flora. Again, I said a big part of this is what we're seeing in the herbaceous layer. We have diversity, number of individual plants, richness. All the trends are the same. You're getting a synergistic effect where you thin and burn. That if you want a diverse, rich understory, you probably want fire no matter what, and the level of thinning is going to really, really add to that. But again, with the stump sprouts, it's ephemeral if you don't manage the other woody competitors to these herbs. And so I have a list. I didn't bring it as a handout, and I should have, but it's woodland indicators. I'm going to skip to that actually because it's a little better. Yeah, this one. So this is a combination of things that we deem indicative of an intact woodland community because they're heliophytic to some degree. They need that sunlight. So it tells us we're doing all right in terms of getting sun to the understory and light to the understory. You can see here where we thin and burn, it's way better. Where we burn only, just takes longer to get there, but it's trending right. Where you thin, it works, but if you don't keep burning, the sprouts take over and you lose that ground flora, desired ground flora layer. So, all right, so wrap it up here, just kind of put some conclusions onto this. If you're willing to take a slower, more subtle approach, burning alone can probably meet your objectives, especially if you're doing it on the right site. If you're not trying to put a woodland in a forest and vice versa. If you know your natural community and the breaks, I think Badger's an example of watching where the honeysuckle stops making berries. I've never heard that, but I love that. I mean, observing stuff like that can be really telling to where you are on the landscape. Yeah, my preference is always going to be multiple burns over time after you've done a few of those, see where you're at mortality wise, canopy wise. And you'll see the function change. The more you burn a plot, the more pyrogenic and flammable it becomes. The more you promote the oaks, the better the litter is for the next burn and the next burn. And then also fire, obviously. And I don't need to tell you guys, this is a great seed bed prep tool. So if you time it right, you can match your forest farm plantings with that. And then again, thinning and burning is a really great synergistic treatment combination, but it comes with high risk, high reward. The more resources you make available, light, water, nutrients, the more competition you're going to have in the forest farm environment. And that can be problematic. And finally, let's see, fire effectively removes small diameter stems, and you need it for that ground flora response. Thinning allows you to be more species specific and really meet structural objectives, but you got to stay ahead of it. And I think fire has to be a part of that. But when you mix the two, you really do jeopardize some of your residual timber unless you're careful. Both because of fire intensity and just all around functionality will change. If you left a bunch of maples in your overstory and just open it into a woodland, it's going to be too dry in there. They probably won't. They may be great if the soil can support their moisture regime, but sometimes they'll just desiccate. Yeah. All right. Was that Anyone have any questions?
So we can hold off the questions for lunch period.
Gonna jump to John.
Yes.
Perfect.
And during lunch, thank you, Gardner, for this night, and I'm sure everybody has questions, so we will entertain them during.
Okay,
Okay, you can.
yeah, I'll introduce myself, yeah. All right, good morning. I guess it's still morning, everyone. I'm between you and lunch, right? That's the old joke. Well, I want to thank Sugata and Raylin and Lincoln University for inviting me all the way from Virginia to speak with you today about, well, if I can get the advancer to work. So I've come a long way. I'm glad I'm not flying today. I'll tell you that. It's kind of blustery out there, right? So I don't know how to activate that. You got to share, right? Okay, all set. So yeah, come a long way. Good to be with you folks, and appreciate the invitation from Sugata to talk to you about this pitch clock rule. How many of you have heard about the pitch clock rule of baseball? Show of hands, show of hands. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to spend about 45 minutes talking about this today. I think it's why the Birds lost their first game, actually. Wait, it's April 1st. So anyway, April Fool's got you. No, actually, I'm here to talk about forest farming markets and the future of just and equitable trade. And I'm going to draw upon my experience for going on 15 years now working in Appalachia and also with partners in the Northeast, because I think given the interest that's in the room today and otherwise, I think there's a lot of analog that we can take from what's going on in Appalachia and see some of that happen here in the Midwest. So good to be with you today to talk about these topics. We've heard ginseng mentioned a lot, and I like to start my presentations on forest farming by saying that it's not a ginseng talk that I'm giving today, right? There's been many fine ginseng talks, so we've referenced it a lot. It is iconic. Janine mentioned that yesterday. Certainly, when you mention forest farming, often people go right to ginseng, but I'm not going to speak specifically to ginseng. It's part of the conversation because my presentation really is about ginseng and all these other non-timber forest products. And there are scores and scores of woodland products that have been harvested for generations. We did some research at Virginia Tech where we went and surveyed primary buyers of non-timber forest products in the eastern United States. And you can see beyond ginseng, golden seal, bloodroot, black cohosh, mayapple, snakeroot, bethroot, Solomon seal, queen of the meadow, witch hazel, skunk cabbage, poison ivy, mullein. All of these products have been purchased and are being purchased in active markets that exist. So I'm going to talk about the universe of that market, where forest farming fits into it relative to the traditional sourcing around wild harvesting, and think about how the markets are evolving so that you understand the role that forest farming can play in terms of a sustainable, predictable, and traceable yield, which many of our companies that buy non-timber forest products, apothecaries, market consumers are interested in seeing with respect to their products. Conscientious consumerism is part of this conversation. And we have these specifically, at least for my focus, focusing on the market evolution, the work that we're doing and the work that's yet to be done. I also like to start my talks, and I think this kind of goes back to Sugata's opening remarks about an experience I had in 2009. I started at Virginia Tech. That's where I hang my hat, Blacksburg, Virginia. It's on the western side of the state in the Appalachian Mountains. And I was hired in 2007 as a forest management extension specialist. I also have a graduate program and teach the agroforestry course at Virginia Tech. And we have these ag research extension centers across the state, like Mizzou may have, or Lincoln, at different farms where there's education, there's research extension that happens. And there is the Shenandoah Valley AREC, Agricultural Research Extension Center, and it's about 900 acres. 700 acres are dedicated to grass finished beef, but there's 200 acres of degraded Appalachian hardwoods on the property. And the property manager saw fit to start thinking about beyond the pasture and into the woodlands and what they could do there. And so picked me up as the kind of forestry guy. We did some activities there, and they have these field days where the farmers come out. And of course, they're spending most of their time looking at some of the livestock research, but we had a forestry stop. So there I was, 2 years on the job, positioned at the tree line, and along come the livestock producers, about 150 of them, pulled by tractors in the trailers. They get off. I'm standing there with my amplifier, and they all come up. And first question I asked was, how many of you have a woodlot on the property that you own or manage? And over 90% of the hands went up on the part of those livestock producers. So the second question was, how many of you consider yourself to be an active manager of that woodlot? And there were maybe 8 hands left. And so it goes, really. We have this kind of distinct division that we've propagated in terms of our land use in the last 150 years or so, where we have that barrier, where we have the pasture, we have the row cropping, and then, like Sugata mentioned, there's the woodlot, right? The back 40, proverbial back 40. It's not really touched, not really managed, oftentimes degraded. But what I've seen since that time in 2009, being involved with the agroforestry community, is that more hands are coming up in terms of interest regarding how to kind of break down that barrier, how to work into the woodlands, how to add value, supplemental income to a whole farm, thinking of that whole property, thinking of all the different types of production activities that can occur across all the acreage. But where we stand today in terms of the USDA's estimate regarding implementation of agroforestry, which is really a model to kind of cut across all that acreage, is that less than 1% of US farms are actually practicing that. I think we're in a precious time right now where that's changing. We're seeing significant investments on the part of both our public institutions, but also private foundations, focusing in on this kind of whole property approach with both production opportunities, livelihoods in mind, but also our ecosystem services, right? Water quality, water quantity, carbon sequestration, air quality, biodiversity. Okay, so we're kind of seeing some of that increase, but we still have a long way to go. So here we go. You can see this is kind of a canned image, but that classic breakdown. See the dashed line there. Well, what is agroforestry promoting? What is it? It is the idea that is being pushed forward. Well, it's really taking what we know about managing trees and canopy, right, and pushing that out into the open landscape, right? Lower densities. We're not talking about blanketing that open space with tree cover. We're talking about strategic positioning of trees and shrubs that benefit the production in the open land, but also taking what we know about cropping systems and pulling that into our woodlots, right? So we break down that division that we often think about in terms of our landscapes. So we have something blended, right? This is a classic image from France where you see an alley cropping system, right? So you have rows of trees, broadly spaced, large enough that you can get actually some implements through there. Some, mechanization can happen. We have a smaller combine. This isn't Shenandoah Valley combine, but there's still some annual production happening within those alleyways. Meanwhile, you're growing that poplar tree crop at the same time. So you're working to kind of increase the efficiencies of land use. Yes, Badger.
Where is this system? I've seen pictures of stuff.
It's in southern France.
Southern France.
Yeah, not far from Montpellier. Yeah. And back to the home garden. So Sugata mentioned this as well. This is really the inspiration for the systematic kind of arrangement that we have today in terms of our agroforestry systems. And I heard someone mention earlier that it's helpful to have those kind of breakdowns, those categories, to think about how that can affect and influence the management on your property, right? So you can be strategic about placement. The home garden model was a little bit more of a mishmash in many ways, but it was really in the 60s that individuals that were familiar with that type of production system began to think about how can we categorize so that we can actually study and have some science around some of the production practices and then communicate in a more effective way to individuals that might implement. So I had the canned image, but this is a real image here I want to show you. This is the Catawba Sustainability Center owned by Virginia Tech. It's about 380 acres, 35 minutes from Roanoke, right? Classic ridge and valley Appalachian landscape. And you can see, I show you that dashed line where we have the breakdown between the open land and then the wooded areas. Well, what we're doing on this farm is we're taking what we know about managing trees and canopy and pushing that in the open space. We have the silvopasture system there, multifunctional riparian buffers, fruit and nut tree contour planting. On the flip side, we're also taking what we know about cropping systems, right, and pushing that into the woodlands where we have golden seal production, ramps production. We actually tap black walnuts there. How many of you know that you can get nice sap and produce syrup from black walnuts, right? We don't have beautiful maple in most of Appalachia. We do have a lot of black walnut, right? So there's an opportunity there in terms of what what's available to you with respect to species composition, and then also mushroom production as well. So this is a blended system that we have, and we host workshops there. If you ever get a chance to stop by, the Appalachian Trail runs right along the ridge, just to the right off the image. Catawba Creek runs through that. It's the headwaters of the Chesapeake Bay. So beautiful farmscape with a lot of agroforestry systems at play. So I know I'm supposed to talk about forest farming, but I just like to give this overview. Got a lot of nice pictures to think about or to show you. But agroforestry, simply defined, trees among crops, crops among trees, right? Or trees among livestock, right? Crops among trees. We're focusing in on forest farming. So this is crops among trees is what we're considering today. And I'm going to talk about the markets because I think it's a really important thing to consider in terms of where forest farming can be situated on the landscape to provide that supplemental income and take advantage of this evolving marketplace. It's not a single tree in the field, agroforestry. It's not letting your livestock run amok in poorly managed woodlands, right? It's not just a single tree where your livestock are congregated. How many have seen this? Of course. I like to show this picture too, because over here you see artificial shade. Look where the cattle are kind of congregating. But here you see they're all on top of each other. So we have what we call agonistic behavior, which decreases efficiencies. You have vector for disease, right? So this isn't really a healthy situation for livestock. When you think about a silvopasture system, that distributed shade across the landscape, those livestock can spread out. It's not Christmas tree farming. I mean, Christmas tree farm can be part of an agroforestry system. And it's definitely not sensationalized wild harvesting, on a reality television show where you're just going into the woodlands with your firearms to gather as much wild growing ginseng as you can find in competition. It is something like this, right? So nice forage base, a pine crop growing, and livestock taking advantage of that comfortable shaded environment, and that forage base able to spread out. So you've got multiple lines of production that are happening in the same space. Something like this, an alley cropping system in Cameroon, where you have maize, it's intercrop with powder puff, the caliandra tree, fast growing leguminous tree, nitrogen fixer. They coppice this tree during the rainy season 3 or 4 times. It's a nitrogen fixer, right? So they drop that down as what they call green manure. In the dry season, they'll let that tree grow up and shade the crops from the harsh sun, and then they'll capture seeds. It's also a great pollinator. So they have apiaries nearby, right? You can feed this to hogs and the chickens browse on it as well. So thinking in terms of that kind of dynamic combination is the spirit of agroforestry. Windbreaks, right? This shared yesterday. Here we have a nice black and white picture related to the Prairie States Forestry Act, came out of the Dust Bowl era. Still lots of remnant windbreaks in the Midwest. It can be something like this in a buffer system, right? So not just sycamore, not just willow, but hydrangea, right? Which likes that kind of moist environment, and you've got a saleable crop there. You're also providing some valuable benefit in terms of water quality protection. And it can be something like this, raised bed ginseng production amongst a healthy stand of trees, and this is in Western North Carolina. Or something like this, right? Tapping your trees, also non-timber forest product. Happens in the field, happens in the woodlands. This is fairy wand. We talked about difficulty producing fairy wand. This is in West Virginia. This grower is actually growing and selling that root crop and is able to do it successfully. Big farms like the Jesus in Portugal here. This is a cork plantation. trees are spread out, there's enough sunlight for forage and the livestock run underneath. Small farms like in southern Germany here, that's an orchard in the backyard with ewes. Places near, we see some shiitake production on log substrate from TSI, black oak thinning. Or we can do some raft style with reishi and mako like we do at the Catawba farm, burying that in a nice moist area by that creek. And then Bahia grass pine plantation. This is in Paraguay. So large operation there, right? Running those cattle through, growing that Bahia grass forage, and you have a pine crop. And we've talked a little bit about, I know Hannah mentioned, we now looking at the applications of agroforestry in urban settings. So developed our built environments as well. Okay, so that's a brief rundown just to kind of give you the concept, but I'm going to hone in now on forest farming and then really kind of dive into what we've learned in Appalachia regarding how the markets are evolving and what consumers of these raw materials are interested in and the role that forest farming can play in terms of adding value to your operation. So we have the old NTFP definition here. It's forest food, medicine, decorative crafts products, basically goods from the woods. And as I noted, for generations, those products have been harvested and traded. And they are shade obligate, excuse me, botanicals, fungi, trees, shrubs used for barks, food, floral, long-standing markets, but we also mentioned personal value as well. So it's not just that you need to sell in the market or you need to sell to a large company, but many people grow these products for their own personal use or just for conservation purposes or all the above. But it's long been sourced by wild harvesting, right? Almost entirely, and Janine mentioned this. So you can run through a bevy of species, right? They can be medicinal, they can be edible. We've long depended upon and long sourced from wild harvesting, which, you know, the wild harvester has no hand necessarily in terms of establishing, protecting, maintaining. They're just finding and harvesting. And that has implications over time, especially when you see market demand increasing. And I don't want to throw stones at wild harvesting because there are many good wild harvesters out there that practice stewardship practices, right? They're involved in sustaining that because it's an important part of their livelihood. But we also do have a segment of the wild harvesting community where there's a lot of mystery around the impacts to plant populations, to these species in the woodlands, and we don't have a good system for tracking that. So there's a big question mark around, you know, what's actually happening in the woodlands, right? We're getting these products, we're seeing market demand increase. You know, somebody mentioned legacy earlier, right? Generational legacy. Forest farming has some teeth in that regard because you have a person, you have a place, you have a production system, and there is increasing interest in terms of finding raw material from forest farmers as opposed to the mystery of the wild harvesting side of the equation. So our ramps, you know, largely from wild harvesting, our bloodroot, largely from wild harvesting, our mushrooms, largely from wild harvesting. And oftentimes it leads to this, right? So you have poaching, you have illegal extraction that occurs, and there is law enforcement out there looking for that. There's public lands that are locked up for any harvesting of plant material, right? So a lot of, like in Virginia, for instance, our Forest Service lands, you can't get a permit to harvest. So if you go and you harvest something on those public lands, might be considered the commons, but at the end of the day, it's illegal. Our state forest lands the same way, right? Maryland just about 8 years ago locked up their state forests for any harvesting, right? So what does that mean for the industry that's growing, right? Decreasing base of supply. Where are they turning their attention? They're looking to forest farmers to help source that. That gives them that traceability. It allows for them to sell a product to their consumers with confidence in branding that this comes from a place, that there's something sustainable about it. And it also helps them with adulteration issues, right? A lot of times with wild harvesting material, they don't know when it shows up. They don't know what form it's showing up in. There may be commingling with other species that were erroneously harvested. That's a huge inefficiency for the marketplace for some of the companies that are trying to process these raw materials into products to put on the shelf, right? You don't get that from a forest farmer because there's verification, right? There's a known production system in place, and they can go to those individuals. and they're starting to pay price premiums. So we talked about value-added products. Forest farming in and of itself is turning into a value-added system. They're paying more just for the raw material outside of even any type of additional value addition you might see by processing and selling your own products. So I've kind of mentioned this mystery around sourcing. You can see the black cohosh plant here in the woods, right? So somebody harvests this, and then it goes into this weird chain of aggregation and trading among the middle people, right? And then it'll make its way at volume to a company in California or Vermont or to Europe, right? So there's a mystery around some of the trade as it exists. And then you get your product on the shelf. But you as a consumer are not certain necessarily where it came from, right? And the impact to the plant populations or your fungi populations. And all this is on the back of this dramatic growth in our nutraceutical industry, globally speaking. This is dated, but 2011 consumer sales in the US reached 5.28 billion around some of these products. And these aren't all woodland species that are sourcing the nutraceutical industry, but a lot of them are, right? It's a big part of the trade. And the herbal products industry, now this is 13 years, but it's actually 20 years or so has grown, right? So there's been this pretty significant resurgence over the last 2-3 decades in interest in natural products. We have a lot of that coming out of our woodlands and pretty significant size market. But as I noted, sourcing is largely a mystery. And we've been talking to the Forest Service about trying to do better by inventory. They're supposed to by the Renewable Policy Act in terms of, that was in the 70s, tracking anything that's sold and traded out of the woodlands. They focus almost exclusively on timber. So we don't have a lot when it comes to non-timber in terms of understanding what we're looking at regarding drain from the forest and what's growing back. So we have this a bit of a mystery at hand, and forest farming is in a position to address some of that. So to kind of study a little bit of what we're dealing with in terms of trade in the Eastern United States at Virginia Tech, a few years back, we conducted a primary buyer survey. So we were able to generate a list of individuals that are purchasing ginseng, which is really the only species that's tracked with any teeth in terms of trade in the United States. And that has to do with international treaty that the United States is part of called CITES. It's Convention on International Trade in Threatened and Endangered Species. Ginseng is on that. And Janine mentioned at the state level, like North Carolina has golden seal as part of their endangered watch, right? But the ginseng, US signed onto that, and each state has to track ginseng transactions. So if you want to buy ginseng, trade across state lines, you have to get a license. You have to report volumes. So that's the only way we could get access to primary buyers. We got access to those primary buyers and asked them, how many of you are purchasing what we call off roots? Now, this is a focus on our medicinal species, not necessarily edible. And we found that a good chunk of them were. So we said, let's survey them about those species. We've already got the data regarding ginseng, but let's look at what they're doing with black cohosh or blue cohosh, right? False unicorn, snake root. How much are you buying? Where are you buying it from? We didn't really have a lot of information in that regard. So we sent out this questionnaire to 700 buyers in the Eastern United States. We had 180 reply. And we basically asked them across these breakdowns in the state, these sub-regions, where are you buying X species and at what volume? So we could get a handle of the distribution, right, in terms of the trade, and also look at volumes and prices as well. And Hannah referenced some of this in her talk yesterday. But what we found first was that, back to the scale of purchasing, we talked about demand and where you want to trade. A big chunk is small trade, right? So less than 45 kilograms purchased, right? That may be the apothecary down the road. That may be your handler, right? The country dealer, as they're called, right? They're buying, small batches here and there, aggregating some of that. Then we have some medium and large buyers that want to buy in bulk. And all of this is really show you that there's options in terms of the volume that you trade. You can go small, you can get big volume, you can go to medium and large. And then lastly, we have aggregators. And those are individuals that are kind of buying from the small, medium, and large buyers and putting that into volume that can go to California or Vermont or Europe at 10,000 kilograms, right? That's a huge amount of root material to produce by yourself. So the aggregator goes to the small, medium, and large buyer, picks that up. Again, this is kind of part of that mystery. They pull it in and then they'll sell to another location, to a larger buyer. And then that's when it gets turned into a retail product. But what we also were able to do was to kind of create these heat maps regarding trade around species. So this is an example of black cohosh. Okay, and you can see hot pockets for trade, southern West Virginia, southwest Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. Some down in western North Carolina. You see some trade up here in Maryland, western PA. Okay, getting over to southeast Ohio a little bit where Badger hangs his hat. We didn't really see any trade of black cohosh in Missouri, but we did with golden seal. So there's some golden seal trade that's happening here. Obviously some ginseng trade as well. Some of it we might not have been able to pick up on. Here you can see false unicorn. So through this research, we were able to kind of figure out, like, you know, where are these markets? And it's important to know where are those handlers that will buy the material you want to sell, in terms of deciding what species you might focus in on in terms of your forest farming operation. But this is what I really want to get to here. Okay, so we kind of understand, you know, the different scales of purchasing. Heat maps are nice to see, but let's look at volumes and let's look at prices. Right? Again, this is all largely wild harvested material being purchased. Rock bottom status quo prices for decades now. Forest farming takes money, outlays up front, establishment, protection, maintenance. You're making an investment. At $3.62 a dry pound for black cohosh, right? 6 or 7 year production window. A lot of effort out front. You got to buy your planting stock. You got to get it in the ground. You got to protect it, right? 6, 7 years down the road, after absorbing all that risk, you go to the status quo market for $3.62 a pound. It doesn't pay off, right? You've gone in the hole big time, right? But let's look also too at the volume here. 264,000 or so dry pounds of black cohosh being harvested. That is a lot of root material coming out of the forests, right? So the trade is real. Bloodroot, 21,000, golden seal, 106,000 pounds. You know, might not sound like a lot, but let's just look at golden seal, for instance. 106,000. You got 200 plants per pound, right? That's over 21 million plants annually coming out of the forest, right? So this trade has been around and it's growing and it's significant. The prices are difficult for forest farmers right now, largely sourced to industry by wild harvesting. But they can't answer to the impacts. They can't answer to investments in community and in woodlands, right? There's just no traceability. Forest farming, through its intentional cultivation, allows for the industry, right? Allows for apothecaries, allows for market consumers to know that that product is part of a sustained yield system, right? And it's investment in a community, and you understand that connection. So it allows for a woodland owner to take a forest floor that's largely vacant, as you might see in this image here, with a stand of trees that need to be managed based upon some of the things Carter was talking about and others have touched on, to take advantage of that space there in that blended agroforestry system, where you get, and you've seen this image earlier, where you have a nice stand of trees, but you're also utilizing that forest floor and those habitat conditions to produce a product that is gaining interest on the part of industry and consumers regarding its sustainability and traceability. Yes, Badger.
It's also things. Where is this from?
Western North Carolina is Scott Persons. So Janine Davis, who spoke yesterday, she's published with Scott Persons, essentially what might be considered the Bible for forest farming. So this is an image from that site. And to the co-management, when it comes to forestry activities, you know, we mentioned earlier, like a 10-year horizon for burning, potentially, or a 10 to 15-year horizon for intermediate treatments around thinning and maintaining healthy woodlands, right? What you have is the opportunity with a 6 or 7 year production horizon to integrate a cycle or a rotation of non-timber forest products in between treatments of the canopy, right? So that's the co-management idea, and that really is at the foundation of an agroforestry system. But the fact of the matter is, and I can't quite finish that, but the fact of the matter is that forest farming is relatively rare. And I noted earlier, agroforestry, generally speaking, is relatively rare. Well, why is that? Because farming is one thing, sales are another. And if you think about those price points that I showed you, and 6 or 7 year investment, they've got to come up. They've got to come up to make it scratch out. Well, we're working on that in Appalachia. We're seeing some real progress on the ground. But some of the big sticking points that we're still dealing with is planting stock availability and cost, right? We talked about seed versus, rhizomes for establishment. Golden seal, for instance, very tricky, if next to impossible when it comes to seed. So you need root starter stock for golden seal. Okay. Well, where do you get that? Can you just go down to your local feed and seed store and find golden seal root starter stock? No, this is very difficult to come by. Can you go get ramp seed easily? No, you can tomato seeds, but you can't when it comes to ramp seeds. So that's an issue we're dealing with. Planting stock availability, really trying to make some infrastructural investments and work with nurseries that are interested in native stock to build that supply up so that forest farmers have access to that at an affordable rate. Expenses associated with establishment and maintenance, right? So $3.62 a pound or $22 a pound for golden seal. Still, all the time and money that goes into establishment and maintenance can make it very difficult to realize a profit margin over time. You have some policy constraints, handling and preparation expenses. Like we were talking about Kentucky. In Kentucky, you can't take a ginseng seed off a plant and go more than 50 feet to plant it, right? That's part of that CITES system I told you about. Kentucky has a kind of its own state entity that's responsible for tracking and sustaining ginseng and keeping it from going extinct. They have a very strict policy standard in place, and that complicates the forest farming proposition. Even though it's conservation through cultivation, you have more of a purist model that's inhibiting the ability to practice forest farming and sustain ginseng and take advantage of the markets. Handling and preparation expenses, Janine mentioned, like, GAPs and GMPs and all of those types of things. I mean, these are products people will consume. So that's an added expense as well. You have to think about being very serious and deliberate about how you handle that material, follow the specs and regulations so that you can legally sell that and, reduce liability and those types of things. Lack of access to expertise. This has been touched on as well. Technical service providers, right? There's not a lot of them out there that have a good comprehension, and heard many times people say, nobody's even thinking about it. Nobody's talking about it here in Missouri. Same for us in Appalachia and Northeast. So we're, again, trying to build that up. There are some programs coming online that are focused on TSPs and kind of building up information around agroforestry so they can better serve their clients. And the market variability in prices for many species. I've already kind of touched on this. It's difficult to see here because this is in the bars in the way, but if you assume 100 plants, I actually need to move that side. So assuming 100 plants per fresh pound, this is golden seal, you got approximately 40 pounds per 10th acre, at 1 plant per square foot, which is kind of a recommended planting density. You're paying $35 a pound for that. So, that's pretty pricey. Think about that kind of investment. When you're looking at $22 a pound, it needs to be more like $140 a pound to make that pay off. Maybe, yeah.
Any kind of prediction of more policy, more legislation, more oversight happening in this industry because of this situation?
There's conversation around it, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is really kind of at the heart of some of that. I mean, Forest Service has a lot of public land. Access is one thing that they can grant, permits and such, but the Fish and Wildlife Service is at the heart of some of the ginseng trade, which when goes ginseng, so goes some of what we call the off routes. So I want to talk about this idea of a national association that we're working on right now, which can be a platform for external affairs and advocacy. to try and change the game, so to speak, when it comes to some of the policies and support around that. But we also have to look at the private side as well, because I think that's where a lot of the investment's going to come, because a lot of these offroots are not tracked like ginseng or looked at closely like golden seal. This is just to show you, this is kind of a busy figure here, but Eric Burkhart was mentioned earlier, researcher at Penn State, and the study published in 2009, where he looked at a bevy of species and did some net present value evaluations around status quo prices, and really found that only ginseng is one that, with an intentional forest farm system, you can actually make a profit given the kind of conventional market prices. All these others lose out, you know, black cohosh, blue cohosh, fairy wand. We just don't have the price points presently in terms of the general market for those to pay off. But I've got good news. Okay, I'm talking a lot of bad news on the market side. I've got good news coming. I promise you. And here it is, the current situation. We do have a changing NTFP market, and I'm not just sitting up here making this up. This is real stuff that's happening on the landscape. Changing NTFP markets is focusing on this traceable, predictable supply with some teeth in terms of revenue potential and monitoring for sustainability. The companies and businesses have to make investments long-term in their availability of supply, right? Otherwise, I mean, you're not being smart. And so they're looking down the road, you know, and with these question marks, they've got to turn their attention to something that has that traceability so they have an understanding, take some pressure off the wild populations as well. And never before seen federal and private investments in producer support, technical service providing, and nursery production as well. And forest farming provides that opportunity to add value to those supply chains, right? Chain of custody from that farmer to that shelf, and that meets the needs of industry and consumers. And here's an example of a product that's certified forest grown, value-added product through Mountain Rose Herbs, and they're paying top dollar price premium for that raw material. And that's carrying forward to the consumers, and they're selling that product. We also have the American Herbal Products Association in their trade magazine talking about a new domestic sustainable supply of forest cultivated medicinal herbs. Right, so that association, which is natural, largest one in the world, I think, it definitely has a global footprint, talking about, you know, this idea of sustainable cultivated medicinal herbs. And we have investments happening local level, trying to provide support systems and services for producers to reduce expenses, time, costs, so on. And then verification programs coming online as well, which carry forward with that product when it comes out of the ground. We're not in Appalachia, but there's a fair amount of Missouri that has a little bit of resemblance, you know, nice deep forest cover, right types of habitat for production. Some of the kind of native ranges for a lot of these species are part of this state. You know, we're looking at this idea of the economic and cultural value around these non-timber forest products, and how to move toward this intentional model with forest farming kind of driving the way. And, you know, do right by many of our forest dependent communities, which are often economically distressed. Okay. We have a lot of that in Appalachia, and I think you do in the rural areas in this part of the country. So here you can see the Appalachian voice celebrating and cultivating forest medicinals, creating healthy economy. Here's an example of Michelle Pridgeon picture, who's a black cohosh farmer and has sold top dollar black cohosh from her farm in Appalachia. Lori Burrow was mentioned yesterday by Janine, also an example of a forest farmer who's been able to take advantage of some of those value-added price points. And I mentioned federal investments and private investments. I've been fortunate enough since 2015 to lead the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, which is sponsored by USDA NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture. We also have private funding from a family foundation in Washington State. 2020, we won the APA Herbal Insight Award at American Herbal Products Association. And we have a bevy of partners. I mean, Virginia Tech is the principal. We've been able to generate over $2 million to support activity in Appalachia. We don't sit on the dollars much at Virginia Tech. It's really a distributed model. So all of our partners, NC State, Appalachian Sustainable Development, Rural Action, Badger's part of that organization, Organic Grower School, Penn State, U Mountain Center, so on, receive those dollars and support in their own pockets throughout Appalachia, this broad network of forest farmers, right? New and beginning forest farmers throughout the region. We have over 2,000 members. We've been able to support producers in establishing over 125 forest farms. We've had over 25 programs, 1,000 plus attendees. We have farm siting precision technology that we promote and folks can use to make some informed decisions about where to site, then taking on some of the things Badger covered and other types of information Carter mentioned, make those specific decisions. We have more than 10 non-timber species that are being farmed and sold. Scores of technical videos watched over 4 million times. We have a huge trove of videos on YouTube. Really important to note that resource because a lot of it is traditional and local ecological and production knowledge. Botanists have studied these plants. You can find extension documents telling you about the habitat and, you know, the vascular components and structure and all that. When it comes to production, we do not have a lot of production science that has occurred in the past from the university side. What we have is we have a lot of people that have grown these plants. Right? I shouldn't say a lot, but a fair amount that have grown these plants and have a wealth of knowledge. So we've really been able to come together across universities, nonprofits, and some of our historical producers to share that information out so that we can continue to expand production across the landscape. And here's the kicker, price points 10 to 20 times higher for the farmed NTFPs compared to the wild harvested material. It's the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition, but it's not just specific to Appalachia. I don't want you to think you can't be a member or you can't use resources. They're all free. And a lot of them carry over to habitats in Missouri, no problem. So I'd encourage you to go to the website. It's AppalachianForestFarmers.org. And from there, you can launch into our social media. You can find our newsletters. You can find our YouTube video sites around specific species, value-added production systems, all kinds of things that we've been able to pull together over the last 10 or so years and make that available publicly. So I mentioned our training programs. We do indoor, we go outdoors, we do expos. We bring in buyers, experts, growers, so they can meet and greet, do share fair type work and start to develop some of those connections. I mentioned our compendium, or at least our YouTube site. Here's Ben Kitchen, Western North Carolina, longtime grower of golden seal, pretty much telling you how to divide rhizomes, densities to plant, how to set it out, you know, how you maintain, how you then move it to market. So you can go and check out some of those videos. We have the social media presence, and then we still have our, you know, classic extension documents that you can launch to in our Forest Farming Footnotes newsletter. I mentioned the technology. This is the plant choose system. Unfortunately, it doesn't extend to Missouri. It's mostly the states on the eastern side, but I'd love to see it out here. And basically, it's a way to kind of query a section of woodlands and get a heat map that gives you an idea of like more suitable habitat. There's like 7 variables we use in the model. And if you got 100 acres of woodlands, right, that's a lot to walk and kind of poke around in and figure out the best spot. This system gives you a first swipe at some of the areas that have habitat that resemble more so than other areas where we see these species growing in the wild. So that gives you kind of a first, you know, point of reference in terms of maybe some of your hot spots across the property. Again, it's not in Missouri, but just want to let you know, I'd love to see that expand. We're also working with legislators. Senator Warner in our state has been a huge champion of some of the work we're doing in Appalachia. He's helped bring in some dollars. He's written letters to the chief of the Forest Service extolling forest farming and, you know, non-timber forest products doing better by accessibility to land, but also tracking and trying to understand. He supported numerous grant applications. Our governor came out to the Catawba farm to take a look at what we're doing. And here you can see him holding a rhizome of golden seal, learning about some of the production opportunities we're carrying forward there, but also how we're distributing to growers in the region, right? Making that planting stock availability a little bit better. Some of the partners in the coalition have, you know, they've gotten their own grants. Here you can see Rural Action work with United Plant Savers and Gaia Herbs, which is a private partner, They received a CIG grant to expand some of the verification programs, again, around production systems that help add value in the marketplace. And the Benedum Foundation out of Pittsburgh has sponsored some work in West Virginia. So some private money going in there to create this West Virginia forest farming initiative. And the Sustainable Herbs Program through American Botanical Council is also one of our partners supporting this work as well. And then, outside of, planting and all of that, on the backside of production, farmers need assistance, because when you think about a 10,000 kilogram order in California, it's really hard for any single farmer, next to impossible really, to produce that much. So you have small batches coming off of forest farms. Well, to get that product up to snuff and get the voucher specimens and have it prepped and ready to go for evaluation by a company down the supply chain, there's a need for infrastructure and support. So the hub model was mentioned earlier, right? So that's what's happening at the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub. It's a facility in Duffield, West Virginia. They have a food hub there, but they've also nested an herb hub. And they have post-harvest processing equipment, sales assistants. Again, that's nested in a certified food handling facility. So again, these are products that people are consumed. You can go into that herb hub with your batch of 50 pounds, put that into a larger batch. All the tracking occurs. I think the fee is maybe 3% of the overall sale to use the facility. And then that goes into that large value-added forest farming volume that's paid downstream at a price premium. And so it aggregates supply from forest farmers that are forest grown verified or otherwise. Some of the farmers are able to sell without being verified. They just demonstrate that I'm growing this, I have a management plan. You can go back to the place and take a look at it, and that gets into that supply stream. And this all started in 2017. It was kind of born out of the coalition where we had a couple farmers try and get their own raw material up to spec to sell to companies in the West Coast. And it took them so long to do that. They basically, even though they were getting paid top dollar, they didn't make a profit. So we said, let's start thinking about this aggregated model. And in 2017, there was one herbal products company that purchased 50 pounds of one species, right? By 2019, there are 8 to 10 companies or so seeking thousands of pounds of 4 species through the herb hub, right? So the attention was gaining, and an interest in investments on the part of downstream consumers was ticking up. And they're paying 10 to 15 times the average price for the wild material. So companies are beginning to explore these contracts with forest farmers long-term, like timber products industries have done with some of your tree farmers, looking at, providing some support on the outset. That product is in contract, right? Once it reaches maturity, it's into the supply chain for that particular company, and they're paying top dollar. And they're also looking at standing up planting stock supply programs. Well, what we're dealing with now, which is an interesting problem to have, is that demand is currently exceeding supply. So I told you I had good news, right? Demand is currently exceeding supply. We need more forest farmers, right? We have 125 plus farms that have been established, but when you think about these slow growing shade obligate species, some of those are just in mid rotation, right? They're 3 or 4 years into it. They're 4 years out from maybe harvesting, right? So it's an interesting time where there's a lot of interest on the part of local consumers, big consumers, and we're trying to find ways to meet those needs. Just some snapshots of garblers and tumblers and things that the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub has for use by forest farmers to work on aggregation. They have dryers as well. So a lot of infrastructure in place to kind of reduce the amount of time that a producer has to spend getting their product into the supply chain, and working on voucher specimens as well that will go to the company for evaluation before the purchase. So I want to talk to you about that Harvest Herb Hub and the prices. I say 10 to 15 times. Okay, what do I mean exactly? Well, you can see here, this is more status quo prices at per kilogram price, mean dry price here, which is about 2.2 pounds per kilo. Black cohosh at $7.96. Look at this per pound of black cohosh, $45. So value added price premiums around the forest farm botanicals. We can see golden seal root, at 130. And I think Badger mentioned the price of fairy wand being higher than golden seal. There is a domestic market, and Janine, of course, mentioned that the bulk of the trade is through Hong Kong, but there's a growing domestic market for ginseng. So you can see root here at $130 per dry pound. Pretty significant leaf going for 350. I'm sorry, that's golden seal. Ginseng root here. I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up. Ginseng root 1,000, 150 per pound. Golden seal at 130. Let's look and see 49, per kilo in the kind of status quo market. So what does this mean in terms of value retained in the region? Because we talk about some, forest dependent communities which may be economically distressed. A lot of the kind of conventional producers not making a lot of money. But if we look at black cohosh as a case example, with some of that research we did, there's that 264,000 pounds, right, with a wild payout of $3.62 a pound per average. That's just under $1 million being paid out for all of that volume coming out of the woodlands. And that's 0% farmed, right? So you have a little less than $1 million. Now, we know there's huge markups as you get down the supply chain, because when that black cohosh is on the shelf, it's hundreds of percent marked up, right? So we want to think about how forest farming can also retain some of the value in the region. So if we were to convert to just 5% farmed, now you're talking about 13,000 pounds it's farmed, and at a very low price point of $25. We saw 43 on the slide before. Now you're talking about $330,000 going to forest farmers, right? You got 909,000 sticking with the wild harvesting community. But now we're talking about closer to, $1,125,000. Okay. And this can go on. This is back of the napkin, of course. But here you can see if you boosted to 20% farmed, you could get at $25 a pound, 1.3 million in the region. Okay. So now you're talking about more than doubling the amount of money that's sticking around. And, we see the interest that we do and the price points that we do. I don't think this is anything terribly unrealistic. We've got a long way to go, but this is what we should be aiming for. So who will farm? We also did some survey work because, we've talked a lot about landowners and producing on, property that's owned. Well, there's some landowners that are not necessarily interested in forest farming, but may open it up to landless producers, right? So those folks that are looking for land for production in a lease model, like you would for hunting, okay? And so we did some survey research and found that there's a pretty significant amount of landowners out there that would be happy to go into some sort of arrangement with a landless forest farmer. You get, like you do with a hunting lease, somebody on site, especially if you're absentee, right? Someone on the land can report things. So there's a little bit of reciprocity there that can occur, but we also have a fair amount that would be interested, particularly at some of these price points, in investing in forest farming. And then we see, I'll just skip past this slide in the interest of time, but okay, so we've got a lot that's happening in Appalachia. In Northeast recently, they stood up a coalition as well. So it's through Yale University. Karim Shaban, who's at Rural Action, was at Yale, and they put in an application for SARE support. And they now have a Northeast Forest Farmer Coalition, which is a sibling to the Appalachian Forest Farming Coalition. So now we've got that broad coverage throughout the eastern side of the United States. And thinking about how we can collaborate. There are different needs and different types of product opportunities in those different kind of ecological spaces, but in concept, we're communicating and sharing resources. Love to see coalition work and growth happen in other parts of the country, Pacific Northwest, Ouachita, Ozarks, right? Upper Midwest, where individuals that are interested can work with universities and nonprofits to begin to kind of share knowledge and stand up some forest farming production. We do have funding from USDA National Agroforestry Center to create, and we're just getting this process off the ground with scoping, bylaws, and a kind of working procedure for a professional society or association that's nationally focused. And, the idea is kind of thinking about AFFA as opposed to ABFFC, an American Forest Farmer Association. What do we get with that? Well, you have the professional society, you have some identity, there are member services that are provided across the country, advocacy and awareness platform. We need to have people at the table communicating with legislators, policymakers, et cetera, to promote forest farming, continuing training and education services across the country. And then also this point of harvest program, and I don't know how I'm doing with time, but oh, we're around lunchtime. Well, let me wrap up quickly with this point of harvest program, because I think this is an important lesson learned on the part of all this work in Appalachia, and then some of what we learned in the Northeast, is we talk about forest farming and we think about landowners. And I mentioned landless earlier, and I've mentioned wild harvesters quite a bit. There are many wild harvesters out there that practice stewardship and sustainable harvesting. There is a element of the wild harvesting community that doesn't care about plant populations. Rather than just wipe them out of the supply chain altogether, we are interested in working with wild harvesters around what Janine called wild managed, right? Or managed wild, she called it, or stewarded wild populations, such that they come to trainings, right? They participate in forest farming programs. They're registered. They go out and are willing to open their books regarding their wild harvesting on the commons to demonstrate that they're also practicing forest farming. They just don't happen to own land. And we don't want to cut them out if they're good actors, because they can also help with this supply chain issue we're dealing with, where we have more demand than we have supply. So we're also working with the wild harvesting community to bring them into the fold with land owning forest farmers as well, because that spectrum cuts across from something intensive like woods grown all the way to stewarded wild populations, or managed wild, as ginseng, or as Janine calls it. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Well, I've kind of talked about big money going into agroforestry. Here we see some investments in native nursery and native seed partnerships. So thanks for the time. Thanks for letting me show up here being an interloper.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munsell, for providing us this last piece of information. We learned about what to do, and one big important thing about anything is how the economics work and how you can be involved in something like that. So that's really important to consider. So thank you very much for providing that context. For the online attendees, at this point, we will end the online portion, because if you go to the schedule, you'll see there is one more talk after lunch, but unfortunately, that person had some issues and is not going to be attending. So we have a in-person activity, which again is difficult to do for the Zoom people. So thank you very much for attending this forest farming workshop online, and hopefully we will get to be in touch with some of you in some fashion. We will do it again next year. So you will get that information, but thank you very much. At this point, we will turn off the online portion of the meeting as we break for lunch. And you have anything to add? No. Okay. Thank you again.
So